A little beggar girl burst into a millionaire's wedding and shouted, "Don't marry her, she's dangerous." A few days later, the millionaire shuddered when he saw what his wife was capable of. The opulent St. Mary's Cathedral gleamed in the morning sun, its stained glass windows casting rainbow shadows across the wedding guests in their finest attire. James Harrison, one of the city's most respected philanthropists, stood at the altar with a smile that spoke of pure love and trust. His bride, Victoria Sterling, was the picture of elegance in her white designer gown, her emerald eyes sparkling with what appeared to be joy. The wedding march reached its crescendo when the heavy wooden doors burst open with a thunderous bang. A small figure stumbled in, her bare feet leaving dirty marks on the pristine red carpet. The assembled guests gasped collectively at the sight of the child, no more than 7 years old, wearing tattered clothes, her unevenly cut hair framing a gaunt face streaked with tears and dirt. "Stop," her voice, though young, carried the weight of desperate urgency. "Please don't marry her. She'll kill you like she killed my daddy." Victoria's perfectly composed face flickered for just a moment before she pressed herself against James, trembling in apparent fear. "Oh God, it's that disturbed child I told you about," she whispered loud enough for the front rows to hear. "My late husband's daughter. She never accepted his death." The girl stumbled forward, her brown eyes fixed on James with a pleading intensity that made some guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. "She has poison in her purse, the same kind she used on my father. Please, just look in her purse." Security guards moved swiftly down the aisle, but the child evaded them with the agility of someone who had learned to survive on the streets. She reached the altar, her small hand grabbing James's sleeve. "My name is Emily Parker. She was my stepmother. She made everyone think I was crazy, but I'm telling the truth. Please believe me." As the guards finally caught her, Emily's screams echoed through the sacred space. She put something in the medicine. "Ask the doctors why Daddy never got better. Please, look in her purse before it's too late." The last thing Emily saw before being dragged away was Victoria's face and the momentary flash of cold fury in those emerald eyes that no one else seemed to notice. Behind her, the wedding march resumed, drowning out her desperate pleas for someone, anyone, to believe her. If this dramatic opening has captured your attention, imagine the thrilling journey ahead. Don't miss a single moment of Emily's compelling story. Subscribe now to unlock more gripping tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Emily Parker's world was filled with the scent of cinnamon and warm hugs before everything changed. At 7 years old, she was small for her age, with deep brown eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond her years and wavy dark hair that her mother used to say danced like autumn leaves in the wind. Her round face, dusted with a sprinkle of freckles across her nose, usually wore an expression of quiet contemplation that made adults pause and wonder what thoughts stirred behind those observant eyes. Before tragedy struck, Emily was known in her prestigious private school as the girl who always carried a book under her arm. Her teachers often found her during recess, perched beneath the old oak tree in the schoolyard, lost in stories of brave heroes and happy endings. She possessed an unusual gift for understanding people's emotions, a trait inherited from her mother, Sarah, who had been a beloved elementary school teacher known for her ability to reach troubled children. Emily's early years were marked by small moments of joy, baking cookies with her mother every Sunday afternoon, stargazing with her father on their roof terrace, and reading bedtime stories where her parents would take turns doing different voices for each character. The Parker family lived in a beautiful brownstone in the historic district, where Emily's bedroom window overlooked a small garden her mother tenderly maintained. Her walls were covered with her own drawings, mostly of their family of 3, always holding hands, always smiling. But beneath her gentle exterior lay a strength that few suspected. Even at 7, Emily showed remarkable resilience and determination. When she struggled with mathematics, she would spend hours practicing until she mastered each concept. When a new student joined her class feeling lonely and lost, Emily was the first to share her lunch and offer friendship. Her mother often said that Emily had an old soul, carrying wisdom in her small heart like a quiet flame. The bond between Emily and her mother was particularly special. Sarah Parker had a way of making every moment educational without feeling like a lesson. During their garden time, she would teach Emily about persistence through the growth of seeds. And their cooking sessions became lessons about chemistry and patience. Even their walks to school were adventures in observation and empathy, as Sarah taught Emily to notice the small details about people, the way a shoulder might slump with worry, or eyes might crinkle with hidden joy. Robert Parker, Emily's father, was a successful pediatrician who carried the same gentleness in his practice that he showed at home. His patient's parents often remarked that he had a magic touch, able to calm even the most frightened child with his warm smile and patient manner. Emily adored following him around their house on weekends, carrying her toy medical kit, pretending to help him review patient files. He would always take time to explain things to her in ways she could understand, nurturing her natural curiosity about the world. Their home was filled with music, Sarah playing the piano while Robert sang off-key, Emily dancing around the living room in her sock feet. These moments, preserved in Emily's memory like precious photographs, would later become her sanctuary during the darkest times. The Parker family wasn't wealthy by their neighborhood standards, but they were rich in the ways that mattered most: in love, in laughter, in the simple joy of being together. What made Emily truly special wasn't just her intelligence or her sensitivity, it was her innate sense of justice. Even at such a young age, she couldn't bear to see anyone treated unfairly. She would stand up for younger children on the playground, share her lunch with those who had none, and always tell the truth, no matter the consequences. This unwavering honesty, which her mother had cultivated and praised, would later become both her greatest strength and her greatest challenge in the battles that lay ahead. Robert Parker's life changed irrevocably the day his wife Sarah died in what appeared to be a tragic car accident. The official report stated she had lost control on a rainy evening, but Sarah had always been an exceptionally careful driver. Her death left a void in the Parker household that seemed to echo through every room, transforming their once joyful home into a museum of memories. In the months following Sarah's death, Robert struggled to maintain normalcy for Emily's sake. He would still make pancakes on Sunday mornings, though they never tasted quite the same without Sarah's secret ingredient. He tried to keep their bedtime story routine, but his voice would crack when reading Sarah's favorite parts. The pediatrician, who had always radiated warmth and confidence, began to show signs of dark circles under his eyes, shoulders slightly stooped, smiles that never quite reached his eyes. Emily watched her father's grief with the quiet perception that had always been her hallmark. She began taking on small responsibilities beyond her years, laying out her own clothes for school, making simple sandwiches for lunch, even trying to tend her mother's beloved garden. The other parents at school whispered about how mature she was, how brave, but few noticed the way she would sometimes pause at the piano, touching the keys her mother once played, or how she kept Sarah's hairbrush on her bedside table, untouched. Robert threw himself into his work at the children's hospital, extending his hours and taking on additional patients. His colleagues praised his dedication, but Emily understood it was his way of outrunning the silence at home. Their evening meals became quieter, punctuated only by the soft clink of silverware and Emily's careful attempts at conversation. She would tell him about her day at school, and he would respond with gentle questions, both of them dancing around the empty chair at the table. The change in their financial situation was subtle at first. Robert's increased work hours brought in more income, but the medical bills from Sarah's final days had left a significant debt. He began selling small things, first Sarah's car, then some of their more expensive furniture. Emily noticed her father spending long hours in his study, poring over papers with furrowed brows, but she didn't understand the full extent of their troubles until she overheard him on the phone one night, voice tight with worry, discussing mortgage payments. Despite their challenges, The bond between father and daughter grew stronger. They developed new rituals, Saturday afternoon walks in the park where Sarah used to take Emily, weekly visits to the library to maintain Emily's love of reading. Robert would sit in the children's section, watching his daughter select books with the same careful consideration her mother once showed, and feel both pride and pain in equal measure. The neighborhood watched the Parkers with a mixture of sympathy and concern. Well-meaning friends and neighbors brought casseroles and offered help, but gradually the visits became less frequent. The world moved on, as it always does, leaving Robert and Emily to navigate their new reality together. They became known as the quiet pair in the big house, the devoted father and his precocious daughter, getting by as best they could. It was during this vulnerable time that Victoria Sterling entered their lives. Robert met her at a hospital fundraiser where she was volunteering with the children's ward. She seemed to bring color back into their monochrome world, elegant, charming, and most importantly, wonderful with Emily. Or so it appeared. No one, not even Robert with all his professional insight into human nature, recognized the calculated nature of her interest, the careful way she positioned herself as the solution to their every problem. Looking back, Emily would later realize that their very vulnerability was what had attracted Victoria like a predator sensing wounded prey. But at the time, even she had been willing to believe in the possibility of happiness again, despite the strange unease that sometimes crept over her when Victoria's smile didn't quite match her eyes. Victoria Sterling embodied sophistication in every carefully calculated movement. Her emerald eyes, which could shift from warm to glacial in an instant, were set in a face that seemed sculpted by the finest artists. At 42, she carried herself with the kind of grace that turned heads and commanded attention in any room she entered. Her blonde hair, always perfectly styled, caught the light like spun gold, and her voice carried a melodious quality that could make even the simplest words sound like poetry. On paper, Victoria's background was impeccable. She came from old money, had graduated from prestigious schools, and dedicated herself to charitable causes, particularly those involving children. Her reputation in social circles was Sterling, the wealthy widow who chose to give back to the community rather than remarry. But like the designer perfume she wore, this was merely a carefully crafted facade masking something far more sinister. Behind closed doors, Victoria harbored a darkness that stemmed from a past she had meticulously erased. The daughter of a gambling addict and an alcoholic mother, she had clawed her way up from poverty through a combination of cunning, charm, and calculated cruelty. Her first marriage at 21 to an elderly businessman had ended with his mysterious death, leaving her a small fortune. Her second husband, a real estate mogul, suffered a similar fate 2 years into their marriage. Victoria's true expertise lay in her ability to identify vulnerable targets. She could spot emotional wounds like a shark sensing blood in water. Widowers with young children were her specialty. Their combination of financial assets and emotional vulnerability made them perfect marks. She would study them for months, learning their habits, their weaknesses, their deepest needs, before orchestrating a seemingly chance encounter. With Robert Parker, Victoria saw her most promising opportunity yet. His reputation as a dedicated pediatrician, combined with his family's old money and the substantial insurance policy from his wife's death, made him an ideal target. The fact that he was still grieving and struggling to raise a young daughter only made him more susceptible to her carefully planned advances. What Victoria hadn't counted on was Emily. Most children she had encountered in her previous conquests were easily manipulated. A few gifts, some attention, and they would accept her presence without question. But Emily was different. From their first meeting, Victoria sensed something in those observant brown eyes that made her uneasy. The child watched too carefully, noticed too much, reminded her too strongly of her own past. Yet Victoria was nothing if not patient. She approached the Parkers with methodical precision, volunteering at Robert's hospital, arranging to be at the same charity events, creating situations where she could demonstrate her kindness and understanding. To the outside world, she appeared to be exactly what the grieving family needed: a sophisticated, caring woman willing to help heal their broken hearts. The community embraced Victoria's presence in the Parkers' lives. The other mothers at Emily's school praised her for taking on such a responsibility. The hospital board members approved of the connection, seeing potential donations in Victoria's apparent wealth. Even Emily's teachers commented on how fortunate the family was to have found someone so devoted to their welfare. But beneath her polished exterior, Victoria harbored a deep resentment toward the genuine love and connection the Parkers shared. Their bond reminded her of everything she had been denied in her own childhood. Each time Emily looked at Robert with pure adoration, each time he showed unconditional love for his daughter, Victoria's carefully constructed facade would crack slightly, revealing glimpses of the darkness within. As she integrated herself into their lives, Victoria began laying the groundwork for her ultimate plan. She kept detailed notes on Robert's schedule, his medications, his financial information. She studied Sarah's accident report thoroughly, looking for ways to replicate certain elements. Most importantly, she started the subtle process of undermining Emily's credibility. Small comments about the child's active imagination, gentle suggestions about the trauma of losing her mother affecting her grip on reality. What Victoria didn't realize was that in Emily Parker she would meet her match, a child whose inherent sense of truth and justice would ultimately become her undoing. Life in the Parker household before Sarah's death was a testament to the power of genuine love and simple joys. Their brownstone, located in the historic district of the city, stood apart from its neighbors not for its grandeur, but for the warmth that seemed to radiate from within. The garden, Sarah's pride and joy, burst with colorful blooms that drew admiring glances from passers-by. Through the large bay windows, neighbors could often glimpse the family engaged in their evening rituals, Sarah at the piano, Robert attempting to sing, and Emily dancing with unrestrained joy. Sarah's influence permeated every corner of their home. Her teaching materials were organized neatly in the study, alongside Robert's medical journals. The kitchen walls displayed Emily's artwork, carefully framed and arranged in chronological order, showing the progression of their daughter's creativity. Family photos lined the staircase, capturing moments both mundane and milestone: Emily's first steps, family picnics in the park, holiday celebrations where all three wore matching sweaters. The Parkers weren't just a family, they were a symbol in their community of what family life could be. Sarah's students would often stop by after school for extra help, knowing they'd be welcomed with cookies and patience. Robert's young patients would wave enthusiastically when they spotted him at the local market or park. Emily grew up surrounded by this web of connections, learning by example the value of community and kindness. Their financial situation, while comfortable, was not extravagant. Robert's position at the children's hospital provided a good living, and Sarah's teacher's salary allowed them some luxuries, but they chose to invest most of their resources in experiences rather than possessions. Family vacations were spent exploring national parks rather than at expensive resorts. Birthday celebrations featured homemade cakes and handcrafted decorations instead of lavish parties. The basement of their home housed what Sarah called their rainy day museum, shelves filled with board games, craft supplies, and science experiment kits. On wet weekends, the family would retreat to this cozy space, emerging hours later with new creations or stories to share. These moments, seemingly ordinary at the time, would become precious memories that Emily clung to during darker days. Each member of the Parker family had their own special corner in the house. Robert's study, with its worn leather chair and walls of medical texts, smelled of coffee and old books. Sarah's music room, flooded with natural light, held not just her piano but also treasured photographs of her own childhood. Emily's bedroom was a testament to her parents' encouragement of her interests: telescope by the window, bookshelf full of both fiction and science books, and a small desk where she would write her own stories. Their neighborhood was the kind where people still knew their neighbors' names and children played freely in front yards until dusk. The Parkers' home was often the gathering place for informal weekend brunches or impromptu story times. Sarah had a gift for making everyone feel welcome, whether they were longtime friends or new families just moving in. The rhythm of their daily life was predictable, but never monotonous. Mornings began with Sarah's famous pancakes, each one shaped to match that day's special occasion or lesson. Robert would read the newspaper aloud, translating complex news into child-friendly explanations for Emily. Their evening routine included a family walk around the neighborhood, often ending with ice cream from the corner shop run by old Mr. Johnson, who always gave Emily an extra scoop. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Parker household was the atmosphere of trust and open communication. Emily grew up knowing her voice mattered, that her questions deserved answers, and that her feelings were valid. This foundation of emotional security, built through years of consistent love and respect, would prove crucial in helping her maintain her sense of truth during the trials that lay ahead. Even after Sarah's death, traces of her influence remained in the way Robert would unconsciously hum her favorite songs, in Emily's habit of leaving wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill, in the well-worn piano keys that no one could bring themselves to touch. The house, like its inhabitants, carried both the joy of what had been and the deep ache of what was lost. Victoria Sterling's entrance into the Parkers' lives seemed orchestrated by fate itself. It was during a particularly challenging fundraising event at the Children's Hospital, where Robert was struggling to manage both his medical duties and the organizational responsibilities that had once been Sarah's domain. Victoria appeared like a guardian angel, effortlessly taking control of the chaos with a graceful efficiency that left everyone in awe. Her introduction was masterfully casual. "Dr. Parker," she'd said, her emerald eyes conveying warmth and understanding, "please let me help. I've organized dozens of these events." Her voice carried just the right note of sympathy without pity, and her smile seemed to brighten the sterile hospital corridor. Robert, overwhelmed and grateful, found himself accepting her assistance without hesitation. Emily first met Victoria a week later, during another hospital event. Victoria had appeared at their booth wearing a sky blue dress that reminded Emily of her mother's favorite color. She carried a small gift, a leather-bound journal with Emily's name embossed in gold. "Your father tells me you love to write stories," Victoria had said, kneeling to meet Emily's eyes. "I thought you might like something special to write them in." The facade Victoria presented was flawless. She seemed to anticipate their every need with an almost supernatural precision. When Robert mentioned struggling with Emily's school schedules, Victoria produced detailed calendars and offered to help with pickups. When Emily mentioned missing her mother's cookies, Victoria appeared the next day with a batch that looked and smelled remarkably similar to Sarah's recipe. At first, Emily found herself wanting to believe in the fairy tale. Victoria's presence brought a spark back to her father's eyes that had been missing since Sarah's death. The house began to feel less empty, filled with Victoria's melodious laughter and the scent of her expensive perfume. Even Emily's teachers commented on the positive change, noting how the girl seemed more engaged in class. But there were moments, brief flickers, when something felt off. Emily would catch Victoria watching her with an unreadable expression when she thought no one was looking. Sometimes Victoria's grip on her shoulder would be just a little too tight, her smile a fraction too wide. These moments were so quick, so subtle, that Emily wondered if she was imagining them. The community embraced Victoria wholeheartedly. She joined the hospital board, making substantial donations that earned her instant respect. At school functions, other parents gravitated toward her, drawn by her charm and apparent devotion to the Parkers. She became a fixture at local charity events, always with Robert by her side and Emily trailing behind, feeling increasingly like a shadow in her own life. Victoria's integration into their daily routine was so gradual that it was almost imperceptible. She began staying for dinner, then sleeping over just this once when it got too late. Her clothes appeared in the guest room closet, then migrated to the master bedroom. Her decorative touches replaced Sarah's crystal vases where ceramic ones had been, expensive artwork where family photos once hung. The transformation of the Parker home reflected Victoria's growing influence. The warm, lived-in feeling gave way to an almost museum-like perfection. Emily's artwork disappeared from the kitchen walls, replaced by professional paintings that Victoria claimed would elevate the space. The garden, once Sarah's wild and beautiful sanctuary, was redesigned with geometric precision by professional landscapers. Emily watched these changes with growing unease. She began keeping a diary, recording the small details that bothered her, the way Victoria would sometimes stare at her father's financial papers when she thought no one was watching, the mysterious phone calls she took in whispered tones, the subtle ways she began to isolate Robert from his old friends and colleagues. But whenever Emily tried to express her concerns, Victoria had a perfectly reasonable explanation. The changes to the house were to help them move forward. The whispered phone calls were about surprise party planning. The isolation was giving them time to bond as a new family. Each explanation was delivered with such conviction, such seemingly genuine care, that Emily began to doubt her own instincts. Robert, still healing from his grief, saw only what Victoria wanted him to see: a sophisticated, caring woman who had chosen to help heal his broken family. He didn't notice how Emily grew quieter during family dinners, how she spent more time alone in her room, or how she flinched slightly whenever Victoria touched her. The perfect facade Victoria had constructed was beginning to show its first hairline cracks, but only Emily seemed to notice them. The systematic destruction of Emily's world began with such subtlety that even she, with her keen perception, didn't immediately recognize the pattern. It started with small things: Victoria accidentally washing Emily's favorite sweater, the last gift from her mother, in hot water, shrinking it beyond repair. Then came the mysterious disappearance of Sarah's sheet music from the piano bench, which Victoria suggested must have been misplaced during cleaning. Emily's bedroom was the first major battlefield. Victoria arrived one morning with professional decorators in tow, announcing it was time for a big girl's room. Despite Emily's protests, her childhood drawings were removed, her colorful bedding replaced with monochromatic linens, and her stuffed animals relegated to donation boxes. "We need to help you grow up, dear," Victoria explained, her voice honey-sweet but her eyes cold. "Your father agrees it's for the best." The changes accelerated after Victoria and Robert's engagement. Suddenly, Emily found herself excluded from family decisions. Her usual spot at the dinner table, next to her father, was now Victoria's place. Family game nights transformed into elegant dinner parties, where Emily was expected to stay quietly in her room. Even her father's traditional bedtime stories became increasingly rare as Victoria filled his evenings with social obligations. At school, Emily's once stable world began to crumble. Victoria arranged for her to transfer to a more prestigious institution, away from her familiar teachers and friends. In her new school, Emily struggled to adjust, finding herself isolated and overwhelmed. But when she tried to tell her father about her unhappiness, Victoria was always there, smoothly interrupting with explanations about adjustment periods and growing pains. Food became another weapon in Victoria's arsenal. Emily's favorite meals were replaced with sophisticated options that left her hungry and confused. Victoria instituted strict portion controls, commenting frequently on Emily's growing figure with false concern. When Emily tried to serve herself more food, Victoria would click her tongue disapprovingly and say, "Your mother would want you to develop healthy habits, dear." The most painful changes involved Sarah's memory. Family photographs began disappearing one by one, replaced by artistic prints Victoria selected. When Emily questioned their absence, Victoria would respond with careful gaslighting, "Oh, those old things? They'd been gone for months, darling. Are you feeling all right?" She began suggesting to Robert that Emily's obsession with her mother's memory might require professional help. Victoria's manipulation extended to Emily's relationship with her father. She began scheduling Robert's hospital duties during Emily's school events, then comforting the girl with false sympathy about his absence. She would forget to pass along Emily's messages to her father, then expressed surprise when Emily became upset about missed connections. "Your father is very busy, dear," she would say. "We mustn't be selfish with his time." Emily's support system was systematically dismantled. Her favorite babysitter was dismissed after Victoria suggested she had been stealing. The kind elderly neighbor who used to watch Emily after school was told her services were no longer needed. Even Emily's beloved piano lessons were cancelled, with Victoria claiming the music was too disruptive to her important phone calls. But the physical changes to the house continued relentlessly. Sarah's cherished garden was completely redesigned, the wildflowers replaced with structured topiaries. The kitchen, once warm and inviting, became a showcase of chrome and marble where Emily felt afraid to touch anything. Her father's study, previously a cozy refuge, was transformed into a formal sitting room where Victoria hosted her social circle. Most disturbing were the late-night conversations Emily began to overhear between Victoria and unknown callers. Snippets of discussions about insurance policies, property values, and investment portfolios floated up to her room, accompanied by Victoria's quiet laughter. When Emily tried to tell her father about these calls, Victoria was always ready with an explanation about charity fundraising or business matters. The final blow came when Victoria convinced Robert to sell Sarah's piano, claiming they needed the space for a proper dining room. Emily watched helplessly as the instrument that held so many precious memories was carried away. That night, she cried herself to sleep, clutching her mother's old songbook, the only piece of Sarah's musical legacy she had managed to hide from Victoria's systematic purge. Through it all, Victoria maintained her perfect public image. To the outside world, she was the patient, loving stepmother-to-be, selflessly helping a grieving family rebuild their lives. Only Emily saw the truth behind the facade, but her voice was growing weaker as Victoria's control grew stronger. She felt like a stranger in her own home, watching helplessly as her world was methodically dismantled piece by piece. The first clear signs of Victoria's true nature emerged on a quiet Sunday evening, 6 months after her engagement to Robert. Emily had been in the kitchen, getting a glass of water, when she heard Victoria's phone conversation from the study. The door was slightly ajar, and Victoria's normally melodious voice had taken on a sharp, cold edge she'd never used in front of the family. "Of course everything's going according to plan," Victoria had whispered harshly. "The old fool is completely besotted. The girl's becoming a problem, but I'll handle her just like I handled the others. No traces this time either. The insurance payout will be substantial, and with his current medical practice. Yes, I've already started with the medications." Emily froze, her glass of water forgotten in her trembling hands. She knew instinctively that she wasn't meant to hear this conversation, just as she knew that the old fool was her father, and that Victoria's plans were anything but benevolent. That night marked the beginning of Emily's secret vigilance, watching Victoria with the keen attention of prey monitoring a predator. Victoria's mask began showing more cracks, but only to Emily. During family dinners, she would catch Victoria studying her father with a calculating gaze when he wasn't looking. The way she organized his medications became obsessive, insisting that only she could handle his prescriptions. When Emily tried to help with the medicine one evening, Victoria's reaction was explosive, though she quickly covered it with concern about proper medical safety. Small incidents multiplied. Emily's school reports, always excellent, began disappearing before reaching her father. Her attempts to spend time alone with Robert were constantly interrupted by Victoria's manufactured emergencies or sudden social obligations. Most disturbing were the times Emily caught Victoria adding unknown substances to her father's evening tea when she thought no one was watching. Victoria's cruelty became more overt when Robert wasn't present. She would accidentally step on Emily's toes during their dancing lessons, grip her shoulder painfully while appearing to guide her gently, or whisper threatening comments disguised as motherly advice. Your father would be so disappointed if he knew what a difficult child you're being became a common refrain, always delivered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The community remained blind to these changes. Victoria had carefully cultivated her image as the perfect stepmother-to-be, making generous donations to local charities and organizing successful fundraisers. She joined the PTA at Emily's school, chaired the hospital board's social committee, and hosted elegant dinner parties that became the talk of their social circle. Each public appearance was a masterclass in manipulation, building a fortress of goodwill that would make any accusations against her seem absurd. Robert's health began to show subtle changes. His usual energy declined, replaced by unexplained fatigue. His hands developed a slight tremor that he dismissed as stress, and his once sharp memory became increasingly unreliable. Victoria was always there with a reasonable explanation, a new vitamin supplement, or a different medication that she claimed his doctor had prescribed. Emily started keeping a secret diary documenting everything she observed. She wrote about the mysterious phone calls, the changing medications, and the way her father seemed to grow weaker each week. She noted how Victoria would react with barely concealed rage when Emily tried to show her father the diary, quickly dismissing it as creative writing and suggesting that Emily's imagination was becoming concerning. The turning point came when Emily discovered her mother's old journal hidden in the attic, where she often retreated to escape Victoria's watchful eye. Within its pages, she found disturbing entries about Sarah's growing suspicions regarding Victoria's involvement with the hospital's charity organization. The final entry, dated just days before her fatal accident, mentioned plans to investigate Victoria's past. This discovery sent Emily into a spiral of fear and determination. She began to see connections between her mother's death and Victoria's current behavior, the same pattern of isolation, the gradual weakness, the controlled medications. But every time she tried to voice her concerns, Victoria was there with a plausible explanation and a concerned look, suggesting to Robert that Emily might need psychological help to process her grief. The situation reached a breaking point when Emily overheard Victoria on the phone late one night, discussing funeral arrangements and insurance policies. "Everything's in place," Victoria had said, her voice cold and businesslike. "The doctor won't question it, I've made sure of that. Just like with the others, it will look like natural causes. The girl? Don't worry about her. No one believes a child, especially one with a history of emotional problems." Robert Parker's mysterious illness began so gradually that even his medical colleagues failed to notice the initial signs. It started with small things, occasional tremors in his hands during surgery, unexpected moments of confusion during patient consultations, and a persistent fatigue that seemed impervious to rest. Victoria was always there, explaining away each symptom with perfect rational explanations that even a doctor couldn't dispute. The deterioration accelerated after Victoria moved into their home permanently. Robert's once steady hands began to shake more frequently, forcing him to reduce his surgical schedule. His sharp medical mind, which had once juggled complex diagnoses with ease, started to show alarming lapses. During hospital rounds, he would sometimes forget patient names or treatment plans, covering his confusion with self-deprecating jokes about needing more coffee. Emily watched in growing horror as her father's vibrant personality began to fade. The man who once spent hours explaining complex medical procedures to her in simple terms now struggled to follow basic conversations. His evening routine of reading medical journals was replaced by long periods of staring blankly at the pages, while Victoria hovered nearby, constantly adjusting his medications with a concern that seemed just slightly too practiced. The hospital board, influenced by Victoria's substantial donations and charming presence, accepted her explanations about Robert's temporary exhaustion and approved an extended leave of absence. His colleagues, who might have noticed the suspicious pattern of symptoms, were gradually kept at a distance by Victoria's careful orchestration of their social calendar. She cited Robert's need for rest, ensuring that any medical professionals who might question his condition had limited access to observe him. Victoria's control over Robert's medical care became absolute. She insisted on attending all his doctor's appointments, answering questions before he could respond, and providing detailed accounts of symptoms that Emily never witnessed. New medications appeared regularly, each one supposedly prescribed by different specialists that Victoria claimed to have consulted. The kitchen counter became a pharmacy of pills, with Victoria maintaining strict control over every dose. The physical changes in Robert became impossible to ignore. His confident stride turned into an uncertain shuffle. The warm smile that had comforted countless young patients grew vacant and confused. His once immaculate appearance deteriorated despite Victoria's supposedly attentive care, his clothes hanging looser on his frame, his hair graying rapidly, his skin taking on an unhealthy pallor. Emily began secretly documenting her father's decline, noting how his symptoms seemed to worsen after Victoria administered his evening medications. She observed patterns that others missed, how her father seemed more lucid on mornings when Victoria slept late and missed his first dose, how certain symptoms appeared precisely timed to important medical evaluations or legal meetings. Late at night, Emily would hear her father's pained moans echoing through the house, followed by Victoria's hushed phone conversations about accelerating the timeline and ensuring everything appears natural. When Emily tried to enter her father's room during these episodes, she found the door mysteriously locked, with Victoria claiming Robert needed undisturbed rest. The most heartbreaking change was in Robert's relationship with Emily. The strong father who had been her anchor after Sarah's death became increasingly dependent and confused. There were moments when he would look at Emily with brief flashes of his old clarity, trying to communicate something urgent, but Victoria was always there to interrupt these connections, steering conversations away from any meaningful exchange between father and daughter. Medical tests ordered by the hospital board came back inconclusive, each set of results suggesting different possible conditions. Victoria used these ambiguous findings to further isolate Robert, claiming he needed a stress-free environment to recover. She began restricting visitors, including Emily's time with her father, citing medical necessity and the need for complete rest. Emily's desperate attempts to alert others to her father's rapid decline were met with patronizing smiles and gentle dismissals. Victoria had carefully laid the groundwork, having already suggested to medical staff and family friends that Emily was struggling with emotional issues and creating elaborate stories to cope with her mother's death. Each time Emily tried to speak up, Victoria's previous manipulations ensured her concerns were viewed through this distorted lens. As Robert's condition worsened, Victoria began making arrangements for what she called inevitable changes. Emily overheard conversations about updating wills, transferring property deeds, and reviewing insurance policies. Through it all, Victoria maintained her role as the devoted caregiver, earning admiration from the community for her selfless dedication to her ailing fiancé and his troubled daughter. The discovery that would change everything came on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening. Emily had been sitting quietly in the darkened kitchen, unable to sleep due to her father's increasingly labored breathing from upstairs. The house was eerily silent, except for the steady patter of rain against the windows and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock Victoria had recently installed. At precisely midnight, Emily heard Victoria's heels clicking on the hardwood floors, a sound that had become synonymous with dread in her young mind. Instead of heading directly to the master bedroom as usual, Victoria made her way to the study. Emily's heart began to race as she heard the distinct sound of cabinet doors opening and pills rattling in bottles. Gathering all her courage, Emily crept toward the study, her sock-covered feet making no sound on the polished floors. The door was slightly ajar, casting a thin line of light into the hallway. Through this narrow opening, Emily witnessed something that confirmed her worst fears. Victoria was methodically replacing the contents of her father's medication bottles with different pills that looked similar but weren't quite the same. Victoria worked with practiced efficiency, her movements precise and confident. She had laid out several prescription bottles on Robert's desk, along with small bags containing what appeared to be identical pills. With surgical precision, she emptied the authentic medications into one container and replaced them with the counterfeits, carefully maintaining the same pill count. Just a few more weeks, Victoria muttered to herself, her voice carrying none of its usual artificial warmth. The fools lasted longer than the others, but everyone has their breaking point. She held one of the genuine pills up to the desk lamp, studying it with a satisfied smile. At least these leave no trace in the autopsy. Emily's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, carefully recording everything through the crack in the door. She captured Victoria's methodical movements, the switching of pills, and most importantly, her damning monologue. The phone's camera struggled in the low light, but the audio was clear, each incriminating word perfectly preserved. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked under Emily's foot. Victoria's head snapped up, her emerald eyes narrowing as they fixed on the door. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice sharp as a blade. Emily backed away, but Victoria was faster, yanking the door open with unexpected force. Their eyes met in a moment of frozen terror, Emily's wide with fear, Victoria's blazing with murderous rage. "You little spy," Victoria hissed, her perfectly maintained facade crumbling completely. She lunged for Emily, manicured nails grabbing for the phone. Emily ducked and ran, her small size finally an advantage as she darted between Victoria's grasping hands. Behind her, she could hear Victoria's heels clicking rapidly in pursuit, the sound like gunshots on the hardwood floors. Emily raced toward her father's room, desperately calling out, "Daddy, Daddy, wake up. She's poisoning you," but Victoria caught her just before she reached the master bedroom, one hand clamping over her mouth while the other wrestled the phone from her grip. Emily kicked and struggled, but Victoria's strength was surprising, her fingers digging painfully into Emily's face. "No one will believe you," Victoria whispered, her breath hot against Emily's ear. "You're just a troubled little girl who misses her mummy. Who would take the word of a child over a respected member of the hospital board?" She dragged Emily back down the hallway, the girl's feet barely touching the floor. Victoria threw Emily into her room, locking the door from the outside. "You've been having episodes lately, dear," she called through the door, her voice once again assuming its false sweetness. "Dangerous delusions. We might need to discuss residential treatment facilities with your father. For your own good, of course." Emily banged on the door, screaming for her father, but Robert's medication-induced sleep was too deep to be disturbed. Through her tears, she could hear Victoria making a phone call in the hallway. "Yes, I think we need to accelerate our timeline," Victoria said softly. "The girl is becoming problematic, just like her mother was." That night, locked in her room with the truth burning in her mind, Emily made a desperate decision. She couldn't let Victoria succeed in killing her father like she had killed her mother. She had to find help, had to make someone believe her before it was too late. But who would believe a child over Victoria's perfectly crafted persona? Hours passed as Emily sat in the darkness, her mind racing through possibilities. She thought about her mother's final days, about the accident that had never made sense, about Victoria's mysterious phone calls and the pills she kept switching. Everything connected in a horrifying pattern that she could now see clearly. As dawn broke, Emily heard Victoria's voice outside her door, speaking to someone on the phone about making arrangements and ensuring there are no loose ends. In that moment, Emily knew she had to act fast. Her father's life and her own hung in the balance. The question was no longer if she should try to expose Victoria, but how to do it before it was too late. Emily's attempts to warn others about Victoria's true nature became increasingly desperate as her father's condition deteriorated. She started with her teachers, trying to explain the strange changes in her home life, but Victoria had already laid the groundwork. "Poor dear is having trouble accepting changes in the family," they'd say, patting her head with pitying looks that made her stomach churn. Next, she tried approaching her father's colleagues at the hospital. During one of Robert's increasingly rare visits to work, Emily managed to slip away from Victoria's watchful eye and found Dr. Anderson, her father's oldest friend. "Dr. Anderson, please," she begged, "something's wrong with Daddy's medicine. Victoria keeps changing it, and he's getting worse." But Victoria's influence had reached even here. Dr. Anderson gently explained that Victoria had already discussed Emily's concerning behavior with the hospital's child psychologist. It's natural to feel scared when a parent is ill, he said kindly, but Victoria is doing everything possible to help your father recover. Each failed attempt to get help left Emily feeling more isolated and desperate. The local police were equally unhelpful. When Emily finally worked up the courage to visit the station alone, Officer Jenkins listened patiently to her story before calling Victoria to pick her up. Such an active imagination. Victoria commented smoothly, her hand gripping Emily's shoulder painfully as she led her to the car. We've been concerned about these fantasies for some time. Even her attempts to document the evidence were thwarted. The phone containing the video of Victoria switching medications mysteriously fell into the washing machine. When Emily started keeping detailed notes about her father's symptoms and Victoria's suspicious behavior, the notebook disappeared during a routine cleaning of her room. The most heartbreaking attempts were with her father himself. During his increasingly rare moments of lucidity, Emily would try to make him understand. "Daddy, please," she'd plead, "you have to stop taking the medicine Victoria gives you. It's making you sick." But Robert's mind was too clouded by the drugs, and Victoria was always there to smooth over these moments with practiced concern. "Robert, darling," she would say, "Emily's having one of her episodes again. Perhaps we should discuss increasing her therapy sessions." Her father would nod vaguely, already drifting back into his medicated haze, while Victoria shot Emily a triumphant smile over his bowed head. Emily's school performance began to suffer as she spent her nights keeping vigil, trying to catch Victoria in the act again. Her teachers noticed the dark circles under her eyes, her falling grades, her increasing withdrawal from friends. All of this played perfectly into Victoria's narrative about a troubled child unable to cope with change. The breaking point came during a dinner party Victoria hosted for the hospital board. Emily had carefully gathered her remaining evidence, a collection of her father's hair samples showing traces of unknown substances, photographs of his rapid decline, and a recording of Victoria's late-night phone calls. She planned to present everything to the assembled medical professionals, certain they would have to listen. But Victoria was one step ahead. As Emily stood to speak, Victoria smoothly announced to the gathered guests that she and Robert had made the difficult decision to send Emily to a special school for troubled children. "The poor dear has been having such difficulties lately," Victoria explained, her eyes glistening with fake tears. "We feel she needs more support than we can provide at home." The guests murmured sympathetically, looking at Emily with a mixture of pity and discomfort. She realized with horror that no one in the room would believe anything she said now. Victoria had completely controlled the narrative, turning her into nothing more than a disturbed child acting out. That night, locked once again in her room, Emily heard Victoria on the phone. "Yes, everything's arranged. The girl will be gone by the end of the week, and then we can proceed with the final phase. No one will question it. A grieving father, lost without his troubled daughter, suffering a tragic accident. These things happen all the time." Emily sat in the darkness, her mind racing. She had tried everything she could think of to get help through proper channels, but Victoria's manipulation was too perfect, her control too complete. If she wanted to save her father and herself, she would need to find another way, something so public and dramatic that not even Victoria could smooth it over. As she sat by her window, watching the lights of the city in the distance, Emily remembered something her mother used to say: sometimes the truth needs to be shouted from the rooftops before anyone will hear it. In that moment, she began to form a plan, one last, desperate attempt to expose Victoria's true nature before it was too late. Robert Parker's death came on a stormy Thursday evening, just 3 days before Victoria's planned date to send Emily away. The house was quiet except for the steady beeping of the medical equipment Victoria had installed in the master bedroom, supposedly for home monitoring of Robert's condition. Emily sat at the bottom of the stairs, listening to the rain and her father's increasingly labored breathing from above. Victoria moved through the house with an air of anticipation, checking her watch frequently and making hushed phone calls from the study. Emily had noticed her stepmother to be seen particularly agitated that evening, repeatedly adjusting Robert's medication doses and shooing away the private nurse she usually kept for appearance's sake. The moment itself was both sudden and terribly slow. Emily heard her father's breathing change, first becoming more erratic, then frighteningly shallow. She raced up the stairs, only to find Victoria already in the room, standing over Robert's bed with an empty syringe in her hand. Their eyes met across the room, and for a brief moment Victoria's mask slipped completely, revealing a cold smile of triumph. "Daddy!" Emily screamed, running to the bed. Robert's eyes fluttered open one last time, focusing on his daughter with sudden clarity. He tried to speak, his hand reaching weakly toward her. "Emily, Victoria, she." But before he could finish, his eyes rolled back, and the monitor's steady beep became a single, continuous tone. What followed was a carefully orchestrated performance by Victoria. She called emergency services, her voice breaking perfectly as she reported her fiancé's crisis. When the paramedics arrived, she played the role of the devastated, almost bride flawlessly, while ensuring Emily was kept away from the medical team and any possible questioning. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure, a natural progression of his mysterious illness. Victoria had laid the groundwork 2 months of documented symptoms, consulting various specialists who only saw what she wanted them to see, the gradual decline that seemed medically plausible to everyone except Emily. At the funeral, Victoria was resplendent in her grief, dressed in elegant black that made her pale skin glow and her emerald eyes stand out dramatically. She held Emily's hand too tightly as they received condolences, her nails digging into the girl's palm whenever Emily tried to speak to any of the guests. "Such a tragedy," people whispered, watching Victoria comfort the stone-faced child. "Thank goodness she's there for the poor little girl." Nobody noticed how Emily flinched at Victoria's touch, or how her stepmother-to-be's sympathetic smiles never reached her eyes. The reading of the will revealed Victoria's true masterpiece of manipulation. Somehow she had convinced Robert to sign over everything to her, with only a small trust fund set aside for Emily, one that Victoria would control until the girl turned 21. The family home, the medical practice, all of it would belong to Victoria once the paperwork was finalized. Emily watched it all with a growing sense of hopelessness. Each adult who could have helped her, lawyers, doctors, family friends, had been carefully positioned by Victoria to see exactly what she wanted them to see. The troubled child, the devoted caregiver, the tragic loss of a prominent doctor who had never quite recovered from his first wife's death. The night after the funeral, Emily overheard Victoria on the phone again, her voice full of triumph rather than grief. "It's done," she said. "Everything's in place. The girl? Don't worry about her. I've arranged for a very exclusive boarding school, one that specializes in emotionally disturbed children. By the time she's old enough to cause any problems, there won't be any evidence left to find." That was the moment Emily knew she had to run. She had watched Victoria systematically destroy her family, poison her father, and orchestrate a perfect murder that everyone else saw as a natural tragedy. She couldn't wait to be sent away to whatever institution Victoria had chosen. She had no doubt it would be somewhere she'd never emerge from. With nothing but her mother's old locket and the clothes she could carry, Emily slipped out of the house that night. As she looked back one last time at the home that held all her happy memories, she saw Victoria watching from an upstairs window, that same cold smile playing across her perfect features. It was a smile that said she had won, that Emily was now truly alone. Victoria's abandonment of Emily on the streets was executed with the same meticulous planning she brought to all her schemes. After Emily's escape, Victoria spent 3 days orchestrating an elaborate show of searching for her stepdaughter-to-be. She contacted the police, organized search parties, and gave tearful interviews to local news stations, all while knowing exactly where she planned to leave the child. On a moonless night, Victoria drove Emily to the most desolate part of the city, far from their affluent neighborhood. The car ride was silent, except for Victoria's occasional humming a cheerful tune that made the situation even more terrifying. Emily sat rigid in the passenger seat, clutching her mother's old stuffed bear, the only possession she had managed to keep. "You know," Victoria said conversationally as they drove deeper into the abandoned industrial district, "you're actually quite clever, more so than your mother was. She never saw it coming at all," she laughed softly, the sound like ice cracking. "But you figured it out. Too bad no one believes children." The car finally stopped in a particularly dark stretch between abandoned warehouses. Victoria turned to Emily with a smile that held no warmth. "Welcome to your new home, dear. I think this suits you better than that fancy boarding school I had planned. After all, you've made me out to be such a wicked stepmother, it's only fitting you get your fairy tale ending." With cruel efficiency, Victoria forced Emily out of the car. The child's small body hit the cold pavement hard, her mother's bear rolling into a puddle. "Don't worry." Victoria called through the window, "I'll take good care of everything your father left behind. And who knows? Maybe you'll survive out here? You've already proven harder to kill than your mother." As Victoria's car disappeared into the darkness, Emily found herself truly alone for the first time in her life. The streets seemed to close in around her, the shadows holding unknown threats. The distant sound of sirens and the scurrying of rats made her tremble, but she forced herself to remember her mother's words. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified. The first few nights were the hardest. Emily learned to find shelter in doorways and abandoned buildings, to stay awake when strange footsteps approached, to make herself invisible when necessary. She scrounged for food in dumpsters behind restaurants, learning quickly which places threw away edible food and which ones deliberately spoiled their waste to deter people like her. During the day, she would watch families through restaurant windows or park fences, remembering the warmth of her own family before Victoria destroyed it all. She kept her mother's locket close, the only proof she had that her previous life hadn't been just a dream. Inside was a tiny photo of her parents, her real parents, smiling on their last vacation together. What Victoria hadn't counted on was Emily's resilience. Instead of breaking her spirit, life on the streets sharpened her resolve. She began keeping track of Victoria's public appearances in discarded newspapers, noting patterns in her behavior. She watched from a distance as Victoria began courting her next victim, recognizing the same calculated moves she had used on Robert. Most importantly, Emily learned to observe and remember everything. She noticed how Victoria always wore long sleeves to cover the distinctive birthmark on her left arm, a mark that might identify her from previous marriages. She saw how Victoria used different names at different charity events, maintaining several separate identities. Each detail was carefully stored away, waiting for the right moment. Through it all, Emily never lost sight of her purpose. Victoria had taken everything from her: her mother, her father, her home, her childhood, but she couldn't take away her determination to expose the truth. Each night, as she huddled in whatever shelter she had found, Emily would whisper to herself, "I promise, Daddy. I promise, Mom. I'll make her pay for what she did to our family." The streets became her classroom, teaching her lessons in survival and patience. She learned to read people as Victoria did, but for protection rather than manipulation. She developed an instinct for knowing which strangers might help, and which would harm, which police officers might listen, and which would simply return her to Victoria's carefully crafted web of lies. Emily's survival on the streets over 6 months transformed her from a privileged doctor's daughter into a shadow of her former self. Her once healthy frame became gaunt, her designer clothes replaced by layers of discarded garments scavenged from charity bins. The unevenly cut hair Victoria had mutilated as punishment grew out wild and matted, serving as a constant reminder of her last days in her family home. Yet beneath the physical deterioration, Emily's mind remained sharp, focused on a single purpose. She developed routines and territories, learning the rhythms of street life with the same attention to detail she had once applied to her schoolwork. Each morning began before dawn, when she could wash in the public restrooms before anyone else arrived. She learned which cafes would let her warm up for a few minutes without calling the police, which church steps were safest for resting. The city's homeless community gradually accepted her presence, though most kept their distance from the strange child who watched everything with unnaturally adult eyes. Old May, who had been living on the streets for decades, sometimes shared her blanket on particularly cold nights, teaching Emily which doorways provided the best shelter from wind and rain. In return, Emily would read discarded newspapers to May, whose eyesight was failing. "You're different from the other street kids, May," observed one evening, sharing a half-eaten sandwich from a nearby deli. "You're not running from something, you're waiting for something." Emily didn't respond, but her hands unconsciously tightened around her mother's locket, her only remaining link to her past life. The newspapers became Emily's lifeline to Victoria's world. She collected every society page mention, every charity event photo, building a picture of her stepmother's movements. Victoria had seamlessly transformed herself into the grieving almost bride, channeling her pain into humanitarian works. The papers praised her resilience, her dedication to children's causes, her generosity in establishing a foundation in Robert Parker's name. Through careful observation, Emily began to notice patterns in Victoria's behavior. Every few months, she would appear at high society events with a new wealthy widower or recently divorced man. Each time, she played a slightly different role: the sophisticated art consultant, the dedicated philanthropist, the sensitive counselor, but her methodology remained consistent. Most disturbing were the society page photos showing Victoria at children's hospital fundraisers, surrounded by young patients. Emily recognized the calculated warmth in her smile, the same false tenderness she had once used to win Robert's trust. Each image strengthened Emily's resolve to expose the truth before Victoria could destroy another family. Living on the streets had taught Emily to be invisible when necessary, a skill she now used to monitor Victoria's activities. She would slip into the back of charity events, hiding behind potted plants or under catering tables, gathering fragments of conversations and observing Victoria's interactions with potential victims. Each piece of information was carefully stored in her memory, building a case that she hoped someone would eventually believe. The turning point came when Emily noticed Victoria's growing attention to James Harrison, a prominent philanthropist known for his children's education initiatives. The society pages were full of photos showing them at various charity events, Victoria playing the role of the dedicated humanitarian perfectly matched to Harrison's genuine commitment to helping children. What caught Emily's attention wasn't just Victoria's obvious targeting of Harrison, but the subtle signs that this con would be different. Victoria seemed to be moving faster than usual, accelerating her usual careful timeline. There was an urgency to her actions that Emily hadn't seen before, suggesting something had changed in her carefully laid plans. Through overheard conversations and discarded invitation cards, Emily learned that Victoria and Harrison's wedding was being planned in record time. The society pages spun it as a romantic whirlwind, but Emily recognized the calculating precision behind the rushed timeline. Victoria was getting careless in her haste, leaving smaller gaps between her identities, taking greater risks with her documentation. One rainy evening, huddled in her usual doorway across from Victoria's favorite restaurant, Emily overheard a conversation that chilled her to the bone. Victoria was speaking to someone on her phone, her voice carrying clearly in the empty street, "The Harrison fortune will be our biggest score yet. Everything's in place: the substitute medications, the altered insurance policies, even the convenient accident scenario. This time next month, we'll be set for life." Emily realized with horror that Victoria wasn't just planning to kill James Harrison, she was planning to do it immediately after the wedding, not taking the months of careful poisoning she had used with Robert. The accelerated timeline meant more risk, but also meant Victoria might be more likely to make mistakes. It was the opportunity Emily had been waiting for, but it also meant she had very little time to act. Victoria's new target, James Harrison, proved to be everything her previous victims were not. Unlike Robert Parker's quiet dedication to medicine, Harrison's philanthropy was widely known and celebrated. His foundation had built schools in underprivileged areas, established scholarship programs, and created safe spaces for at-risk youth. The irony of Victoria targeting someone so dedicated to helping children wasn't lost on Emily. Through careful observation, Emily learned Harrison's routines. He spent his mornings visiting various youth centers, afternoons in foundation meetings, and evenings attending charity functions. Unlike Victoria's carefully crafted public persona, Harrison's generosity was genuine. Emily would watch him interact with children at his centers, noting how different his natural warmth was from Victoria's calculated charm. What made Harrison particularly vulnerable was his recent loss. His wife had died 2 years earlier, leaving him to raise their teenage daughter alone. Victoria had clearly identified this emotional wound, positioning herself as someone who understood his pain. She began volunteering at his foundation, orchestrating seemingly chance encounters that Emily recognized all too well from her father's courtship. Emily noticed something else about Harrison that distinguished him from her father: a subtle sharpness in his gaze when he watched people interact, an attention to detail that suggested he wasn't as easily fooled as Victoria might think. During charity events, Emily observed him watching Victoria when she thought no one was looking, his expression thoughtful rather than besotted. The society pages were full of their whirlwind romance, but Emily could see cracks in Victoria's usually perfect performance. She was rushing things, making small mistakes she would never have made before. At one foundation event, Victoria used the wrong name when referring to her supposedly deceased husband. At another, she gave conflicting stories about her background to different board members. Harrison's teenage daughter, Rachel, seemed to share Emily's instinctive distrust of Victoria. Emily would watch their interactions from her hiding places, noting how Rachel's polite smile never reached her eyes. Once, Emily overheard an argument between Rachel and her father, where the girl expressed concerns about Victoria's inconsistent stories. Harrison's response was measured, neither dismissing nor fully accepting his daughter's suspicions. Emily began leaving anonymous notes for Harrison, pointing out discrepancies in Victoria's background. She took careful photographs with a discarded disposable camera, documenting Victoria's meetings with mysterious figures in back alleys. Each piece of evidence was carefully placed where Harrison would find it slipped under his office door, tucked into his daily newspaper, left on his car windshield. Victoria's growing frustration with these obstacles became evident in her increasingly erratic behavior. She started making more frequent calls to her mysterious associates, her voice carrying traces of panic that Emily had never heard before. The wedding date was moved up twice, each change accompanied by plausible explanations that nonetheless raised eyebrows among the society circles. Then came the incident that almost revealed Emily's presence. During a foundation event, she had crept too close while trying to photograph Victoria exchanging what looked like prescription bottles with a man in medical scrubs. Victoria had sensed something, turning sharply toward Emily's hiding place. For a moment their eyes almost met, and Emily saw real fear flash across Victoria's perfect features before she managed to slip away into the crowd. That night, Emily overheard Victoria on the phone, her voice tight with controlled rage. "Someone's been watching us. The Harrison job might be compromised. We need to move faster, eliminate anyone who might interfere." The threat was clear, but Emily couldn't back down now. She had come too far, lost too much to let Victoria claim another victim. The wedding preparations continued at a frantic pace, with Victoria insisted on handling every detail personally. Emily noticed how she paid particular attention to the catering arrangements, specifically the champagne selection for the toast. It was all too familiar, the same attention to detail Victoria had shown before Robert's final decline began. The wedding interruption that would change everything almost didn't happen. Emily had spent the morning hesitating outside St. Mary's Cathedral, watching the elegant guests arrive in their expensive cars, each one passing by without noticing the small, ragged figure in the shadows. Her stomach churned with a mixture of hunger and fear as she debated whether anyone would even listen to a street child's accusations against someone as respected as Victoria Sterling. The church's grandeur only emphasized Emily's current state. Her once beautiful dark hair hung in matted clumps around her thin face. Her clothes were little more than clean rags she'd managed to find at a church donation bin. The weight of her mother's locket seemed to grow heavier against her chest as she watched Victoria arrive, resplendent in white, playing the blushing bride to perfection. What finally propelled Emily into action was seeing Victoria's careful attention to her designer purse, the same behavior she'd noticed before her father's death. Through the church's stained glass windows, she could see Victoria checking something inside it repeatedly, her movements precise and nervous in a way that only Emily would recognize. The moment Emily burst through the heavy wooden doors, time seemed to slow. She could see every detail with crystal clarity: the shocked faces of the guests, Victoria's perfectly composed mask slipping for just a fraction of a second, and most importantly, James Harrison's sharp, analytical gaze taking in every detail of the scene before him. Emily's voice, unused to speaking above a whisper after months on the streets, cracked as she made her accusation. Yet something in her desperate sincerity made several guests lean forward, especially when she mentioned specific details about Victoria's involvement in her father's death. Harrison, rather than immediately dismissing her like others had, watched Victoria's reaction with keen interest. Victoria's performance was flawless almost. To most observers, she played the part of the concerned, frightened bride perfectly. But Emily noticed how her hand tightened on her purse, how her eyes darted briefly to the champagne glasses waiting for the reception. Most importantly, Harrison seemed to notice these details too. When security moved to remove Emily, Harrison's voice cut through the chaos with unexpected authority. "Wait," he commanded, his tone making everyone freeze. "Let's hear what she has to say." Victoria's face showed genuine fear for the first time, quickly masked by concern for her disturbed stepdaughter. But before Emily could say more, Victoria's carefully laid backup plan sprang into action. Two men Emily recognized from Victoria's secret meetings appeared, claiming to be from child services. They moved with practiced efficiency, physically removing Emily while Victoria put on a show of distress about her poor, troubled stepdaughter who needed professional help. As she was being dragged away, Emily locked eyes with Harrison one last time. In that brief moment, she saw something that gave her hope, not pity or dismissal, but sharp, focused interest. He had noticed something in her desperate warning, something that made him look at his bride to be with new, calculating eyes. The next few hours were a blur of motion and fear. The men claiming to be from child services drove Emily through the city's winding streets, clearly intending to take her somewhere she'd never be found. But years of watching Victoria's schemes had taught Emily to be prepared. At a red light, she managed to slip free, darting into a crowd of weekend shoppers. Her escape sent Victoria's carefully laid plans into chaos. Emily could hear police sirens in the distance, but she knew they weren't looking for her. They were responding to Victoria's practiced tears about her dangerous, disturbed stepdaughter threatening her special day. The same performance that had worked so many times before. What Victoria didn't know was that her perfect day had already been irreparably damaged. James Harrison, the man who had built his fortune on careful observation and analysis, had seen the truth in a ragged child's desperate warning. Even as Emily ran through the city's back alleys, Harrison was making his own quiet investigations into his bride-to-be's past. The meeting between Emily and James Harrison occurred in an unexpected way 3 days after the wedding interruption. Emily had been huddled in her usual hiding spot near Victoria's favorite restaurant, watching for any signs of her stepmother's next move, when a black sedan pulled up beside her. Instead of the child services workers she feared, James Harrison himself stepped out, his expression kind but serious. "I've been looking for you," he said simply, keeping a respectful distance that immediately set him apart from others who had approached her on the streets. "I think we need to talk about Victoria Sterling." He held out a paper bag containing a warm sandwich and a bottle of water, not as a bribe, but as a recognition of her basic needs. In the safety of Harrison's private office, with his daughter Rachel present as a witness, Emily finally had the chance to tell her complete story. She spoke for hours, her voice growing stronger as she detailed Victoria's systematic destruction of her family. Harrison listened intently, taking notes and occasionally asking precise, thoughtful questions that revealed his own suspicions. "After you interrupted the wedding," Harrison explained, "I had my security team do some deep background checking. Victoria Sterling isn't her real name. We found at least 3 other identities, each connected to a suspicious death." He spread photographs across his desk, showing Victoria with different hair colors, different names, but always the same calculating look in her emerald eyes. Rachel, who had been quietly supportive throughout the conversation, shared her own observations. "She slipped up with me once," she said, mentioned details about her supposed childhood that completely contradicted what she'd told Dad. "When I confronted her, she got this look in her eyes." She shuddered, and Emily nodded in understanding, knowing exactly the cold fury Rachel had witnessed. Harrison's resources and influence opened doors that had been firmly closed to Emily before. His private investigators uncovered Victoria's pattern of targeting wealthy widowers with children, her careful manipulation of medical records, and her network of collaborators in the medical field who helped her obtain prescription medications. Most significantly, Harrison had managed to obtain security camera footage from the hospital where Robert Parker had worked. The grainy videos showed Victoria meeting with various suspicious characters in secluded corridors, exchanging what appeared to be prescription bottles and documents. It was the first concrete evidence of her crimes. Emily found herself struggling to adjust to being believed after so long. Harrison arranged for her to stay in a secure location, provided her with clean clothes and regular meals, and most importantly, treated her with a respect she hadn't experienced since her father's death. Rachel became a constant presence, offering the understanding that only another child who had seen through Victoria's facade could provide. But Victoria was far from defeated. When she realized Harrison was investigating her past, she accelerated her plans. She began making appearances at society events alone, playing the part of the wounded almost bride whose wedding had been ruined by a disturbed child. Her public sympathy campaign was calculated to discredit any accusations before they could be made public. Harrison matched her move for move. He quietly contacted families from Victoria's past, gathering testimonies from children who had witnessed similar suspicious behavior before their fathers' deaths. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, creating a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Emily watched these developments with a mixture of hope and fear. She recognized Victoria's growing desperation in her increasingly erratic behavior, the same desperation she had shown in the days before Robert's death. Harrison's security team reported multiple attempts to breach his office and home, suggesting Victoria was searching for the evidence they had gathered. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Harrison's investigation had uncovered Victoria's real identity. She was born Margaret Wells, daughter of a small-town pharmacist who had died under suspicious circumstances shortly after she turned 18. This discovery opened up a whole new line of investigation into her earliest crimes. The day Victoria attempted to poison James Harrison dawned bright and clear, belying the darkness that was about to unfold. She had arranged a private dinner at Harrison's mansion, ostensibly to clear the air after the wedding disruption. Emily, watching from her secure room in the same house, felt her heart race as she observed Victoria's arrival through the security monitors Harrison had installed. Victoria was the picture of elegance in a crimson dress that made her emerald eyes even more striking. She carried an expensive bottle of wine, a peace offering she claimed, and her trademark designer purse, which Emily knew would contain something far more sinister. The security cameras caught every detail: the slight tremor in Victoria's hand as she handed over the wine, the calculated warmth of her smile, the way her eyes darted to Harrison's drinks cabinet. Harrison played his part perfectly, appearing to be completely disarmed by Victoria's apparent vulnerability. "I've missed you," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of longing. "Perhaps we were too hasty in letting a child's wild accusations come between us." Victoria's face showed a flash of triumph so brief that only Emily, watching intently, would have caught it. The dinner proceeded according to Victoria's careful choreography. She insisted on serving the wine herself, explaining it needed to be poured with a special technique to bring out its full flavor. Harrison allowed her to fuss over the glasses, seemingly oblivious to the quick movement of her hand as she added something to his drink when she thought he wasn't looking. What Victoria didn't know was that every moment was being recorded by multiple hidden cameras Harrison had installed. Every angle was covered, every movement captured in high-definition clarity. More importantly, she didn't notice the slight gesture Harrison made that sent his security team into silent, practiced motion around the house's perimeter. The conversation flowed smoothly as Victoria worked to regain her position of trust. She spoke of her plans for children's charities, her dreams of using Harrison's resources to help others, all while watching his wine glass with barely concealed anticipation. Harrison took small sips, appearing to grow increasingly relaxed and vulnerable. "You know," Harrison said, his voice slightly slurred, "I've been thinking about what that girl Emily said at the wedding." Victoria's hand tightened imperceptibly on her own glass. "Such a troubled child," she responded smoothly. "I blame myself, really. Perhaps if I'd gotten her professional help sooner after her father's death." Harrison's next words froze Victoria in mid-reach for her purse. "Interesting that you mention her father's death. I've been looking into Robert Parker's medical records." The change in Victoria's expression was subtle but unmistakable, a flash of panic quickly masked by practiced concern. "Oh," she said, her voice perfectly controlled. "And what did you find?" "Nothing at first," Harrison continued, his words still slightly blurred. "But when I started looking into the pharmacy records, some interesting patterns emerged, particularly regarding certain prescription medications that were consistently altered just before being administered." Victoria's composure slipped for just a moment as she realized Harrison wasn't as affected by her drugged wine as he appeared. She reached for her purse with practiced casualness, but Harrison's next words stopped her cold. "Looking for this?" he asked, holding up a small vial identical to the one she had planned to use. "We found it in your purse when you were in the powder room. Quite a sophisticated poison, leaves no trace after 24 hours. The mask fell completely then, Victoria's beautiful features transforming into something hard and predatory. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she hissed, all pretense of refinement gone. "Do you think you're the first person to think they could outsmart me?" The dramatic confrontation and revelation unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of truth. Victoria, realizing she was trapped, underwent a terrifying transformation. The elegant socialite facade crumbled away, revealing the calculating predator beneath. Her emerald eyes, once warm and inviting, turned cold as winter frost as she assessed her situation with the precision of a cornered snake. "You think you have evidence?" Victoria's laugh was brittle and sharp. "I've been doing this for 20 years, James. Grieving widowers, their troubled children, all so desperate to believe in second chances. Your precious evidence won't stand up in court any more than Emily's accusations did." She reached slowly into her purse, her movements deliberate and threatening. Harrison maintained his composure, though his hand moved closer to the security alarm under the table. "We found your real identity, Margaret Wells, the pharmaceutical company your father owned, the suspicious insurance payouts, the string of dead husbands across 3 states. It's quite an impressive resume." Victoria's reaction was instantaneous and violent. In one fluid motion, she upended the heavy oak dining table, sending crystal and china crashing to the floor. The sound of breaking glass punctuated her scream of rage as she lunged toward Harrison, a second vial of clear liquid clutched in her hand. "My father was a fool, just like all the others," she snarled, her perfectly manicured nails now resembling claws as she tried to reach Harrison's throat. "He thought he could control me, keep me from what was rightfully mine. Just like Robert Parker thought he could protect his precious daughter from the truth." Security rushed in, but Victoria was faster than anyone anticipated. She threw the vial at Harrison's face, missing by inches as he ducked. The glass shattered against the wall, leaving an ominous stain on the expensive wallpaper. "You have no idea what I'm capable of," she hissed, backing toward the door. "Ask Emily about her mother's accident. Ask her about all the accidents I've arranged over the years." Emily, watching from the security room, felt her blood run cold as Victoria continued her confession, each word dripping with venomous pride. Sarah Parker was getting too close to the truth. One loose break line, one rainy night, it was almost poetic. And Robert? He practically begged for those pills, anything to dull the pain of losing his precious wife. Harrison's security team moved to surround Victoria, but she had positioned herself strategically near a window. "You're all so pathetically predictable," she sneered. The grieving widower, the desperate child seeking justice, the hero trying to save everyone. I've played this game a dozen times before. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Victoria reached into her dress and pulled out a small revolver, a detail that even Harrison's careful planning hadn't anticipated. "Back off," she commanded, her voice steady despite the madness in her eyes. "Or I'll add another tragic accident to my collection." The security team froze, their training warring with the unexpected situation. Harrison raised his hands slowly, his voice remaining calm. "Think about what you're doing, Victoria. The house is surrounded. There's nowhere to go." Victoria's laugh was almost hysterical. "Nowhere to go? I always have somewhere to go. I have identities you haven't even discovered yet, bank accounts you'll never find. This isn't the end, it's just another transformation." She began backing toward the study door, the gun moving between Harrison and the security team. "You know what the best part is," she taunted. "Even with everything you think you know, you still don't understand half of what I've done. The children I've eliminated, the families I've destroyed." Emily was lucky. "I usually don't leave witnesses." Victoria's violent reaction transformed the elegant mansion into a battlefield. As she backed toward the study, her gun trained on Harrison, she knocked over an antique lamp, sending shadows dancing across the walls. The security team maintained their distance, their own weapons drawn but useless against the unpredictability of a cornered predator. "You know what fascinates me?" Victoria's voice had taken on a sing-song quality that was more terrifying than her earlier rage. "How easily people believe what they want to believe. A grieving widower sees a chance for love. A lonely child sees a mother figure. And you." She laughed, high and brittle. "You thought you could play the hero." Emily, still watching from the security room, saw Victoria's free hand moving toward her purse again. She recognized that movement, the same gesture she'd seen before her father's final moments. Without thinking, Emily pressed the emergency button that would unlock the security room door. She couldn't watch another person die at Victoria's hands. "It's almost disappointing how easy it was," Victoria continued, her emerald eyes gleaming with malice. "Robert actually thanked me as I gave him his last dose of poison. 'You take such good care of me,' he said. Can you imagine?" She took another step backward, closer to the study where Emily knew she kept her emergency escape supplies hidden. Harrison moved slightly, drawing Victoria's attention. "You made one mistake," he said calmly. "You got careless, rushed things, started leaving traces that even the best cleanup crew couldn't hide." Victoria's laugh turned into something ugly. "Careless? I've perfected this art over decades. Every death ruled natural causes, every inheritance transferred legally. Even the children, she paused, savoring the horror on Harrison's face. You'd be amazed how easy it is to have troubled children committed to institutions where they're never heard from again. The security team had been slowly repositioning themselves, but Victoria noticed. In a flash, she grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from a nearby table and hurled it at the nearest guard. The shattering glass provided the distraction she needed to dart into the study, slamming and locking the heavy door behind her. What happened next was chaos. Victoria had clearly prepared for this possibility. Smoke began pouring from under the study door. She'd triggered some kind of device inside. The security team rushed to break down the door as alarms blared throughout the mansion. Emily, who had made her way down from the security room, knew something they didn't. Her months of watching Victoria had revealed the study's secret, a hidden panel in the bookcase that led to a tunnel system beneath the mansion. Victoria had shown it to her once, bragging about always having an escape route. Without warning, Emily darted past the guards and through the smoke-filled study. She could hear Victoria's heels clicking on the stone steps of the secret passage. Behind her, Harrison's voice called out in alarm, but she couldn't stop. This was her one chance to end Victoria's reign of terror. The tunnel was dark and cold, the air heavy with decades of dust. Emily could barely see Victoria's figure ahead, illuminated only by the emergency lights that lined the passage. The sound of pursuit echoed behind them. Harrison and his security team had discovered the secret entrance. "I should have killed you when I had the chance," Victoria's voice floated back through the darkness. "Just like your meddling mother. She was investigating me too, you know, right up until her brake lines mysteriously failed." Emily kept moving forward, her small size allowing her to navigate the narrow passage more quickly than Victoria in her elegant dress. The distance between them was closing. "You're wrong," Emily called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "But you didn't win. You didn't break me. And now everyone will know the truth." James Harrison's sacrifice to save Emily came at the most desperate moment of the pursuit. The tunnel had opened into an abandoned subway maintenance area, where Victoria had finally turned to face her pursuers. Her designer dress was torn and dirty, her perfect hair in disarray, but the gun in her hand was steady as she aimed it at Emily's heart. "You're just like your mother," Victoria spat, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. She couldn't leave well enough alone either, always asking questions, always poking around where she didn't belong. At least she died quickly. You've been a much more persistent problem. Emily stood frozen, her small frame trembling but her eyes steady as she faced her tormentor. Years of fear and pain crystallized into this moment. "My mother was trying to protect people from you," she said, her voice carrying a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Just like I'm doing now." Victoria's laugh was hollow and sharp. "Protect people? Do you know what people are like, little girl? They're weak, stupid, desperate to believe in fairy tales. I just give them what they want, a beautiful lie to die for." Her finger tightened on the trigger. "And now it's time to tie up the last loose end." The gunshot echoed through the tunnel like thunder, but Emily felt no pain. Instead, she found herself being thrown sideways as Harrison launched himself between her and Victoria. The impact of the bullet threw him against the wall, his blood staining the concrete as he crumpled to the ground. No Emily's scream mixed with Victoria's cry of frustration. The security team burst through the tunnel entrance, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but Victoria was already disappearing through another passageway, her laughter echoing behind her like a ghost's. Emily crawled to Harrison's side, her small hands pressing against his wound as she'd seen done in her father's hospital. "Please don't die," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't leave me alone with her again." Harrison's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Emily with effort. "Listen to me," he whispered, his voice strained. "In my pocket. Evidence. Everything she's done. Keep it safe." His hand fumbled weakly, pulling out a small USB drive stained with his blood. The security team split, half pursuing Victoria while others called for medical assistance. the tunnel filled with the sound of sirens as emergency services responded to the shooting. Through it all, Emily remained by Harrison's side, holding his hand and watching his life blood seep between her fingers. "Stay with me," she pleaded, memories of her father's final moments overwhelming her. "You believed me when no one else would. You tried to help me. Please don't go like Daddy did." Harrison's breathing was becoming labored, but his grip on Emily's hand remained strong. "You're so brave," he managed, "just like your mother must have been. Don't let her." When his words trailed off as unconsciousness claimed him. The paramedics arrived, their efficient movements pushing Emily aside as they worked to stabilize Harrison. She clutched the USB drive to her chest, understanding its importance even as her world seemed to be crumbling again. Somewhere in the darkness, Victoria was escaping, but the evidence in Emily's hands might finally be enough to stop her. As the paramedics rushed Harrison away, Emily found herself standing in the blood-stained tunnel, holding the key to exposing Victoria's crimes, but facing the terrible possibility of losing another protector. The sound of distant gunfire suggested the pursuit of Victoria continued, but Emily's focus remained on the ambulance's retreating sirens, carrying with them her hopes for justice and a chance at a new family. The hospital corridor seemed endless as Emily sat outside the intensive care unit, her small frame curled into a plastic chair that was far too large for her. The USB drive Harrison had given her was clutched tightly in her hand, its edges leaving imprints in her palm. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment echoed through the sterile hallway, each sound a reminder of another life hanging in the balance because of Victoria. Rachel Harrison paced the corridor, her teenager's composure cracking with every passing hour without news of her father's condition. The two girls, despite their age difference, found comfort in each other's presence. They shared the unique understanding of what it meant to see through Victoria's perfect facade and face the consequences. The bullet missed his heart, a surgeon finally reported after hours of tense waiting. But there's been significant blood loss and trauma. The next 24 hours will be critical. The words were hauntingly familiar to Emily. She had heard similar phrases before her father's death, though his poisoning had been slower and more insidious than a bullet. Security guards were stationed at every entrance to the ICU, their presence a stark reminder that Victoria was still at large. The news was reporting her escape, broadcasting the first real photos of her true identity across every channel. Emily watched the coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and dread, knowing that a cornered Victoria was more dangerous than ever. The USB drive contained everything: financial records showing money transfers from deceased husbands' accounts, pharmaceutical orders for various poisons, detailed notes on each victim's declining health, and most damning of all, Victoria's own recorded confessions from Harrison's security cameras. The police were building their case, but Emily knew from bitter experience that evidence alone wasn't always enough to stop Victoria. Hospital staff moved quietly around them, some recognizing Emily from her father's time as a respected colleague. Their faces showed a mixture of pity and shame. Many had been present during Robert Parker's mysterious decline and had accepted Victoria's explanations without question. Now they understood their unwitting role in her schemes. Emily couldn't bring herself to leave the hospital, even when social workers gently suggested she needed rest. "I have to be here," she insisted, her voice hoarse from unshed tears. "I have to know if he'll survive." The social workers exchanged concerned looks but didn't press the issue, perhaps understanding that this vigil was about more than just Harrison's recovery. The nights were the hardest. The hospital's rhythms slowed, leaving too much quiet for memories to surface. Emily would doze fitfully in her chair, only to jerk awake in panic, convinced she had heard Victoria's distinctive heel clicks on the linoleum floors. Each time the security guards would reassure her, but the fear remained. Rachel brought Emily clean clothes and food, caring for the younger girl with a gentleness that belied her own terror. They took turns sitting with Harrison during the brief visiting periods allowed by the ICU staff. His normally strong presence was diminished by machines and tubes, his skin pale against the white hospital sheets. During one of these visits, Harrison briefly regained consciousness. His eyes focused on Emily with difficulty, and he managed to whisper, "Safe. Keep her safe," before slipping back into unconsciousness. The nurses said this was normal, that his body needed time to heal, but Emily recognized the same desperate urgency she'd seen in her father's final attempts to warn her about Victoria. The media camped outside the hospital, their cameras and questions creating a circus that Emily watched through windows. They had transformed her story into headlines: "Child vigilante exposes Black Widow killer, millionaire's young savior, deadly stepmother's reign of terror." None of them captured the real horror of living through Victoria's systematic destruction of families. 1 week after the shooting, Harrison developed a fever. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about infection and complications, their concerned faces triggering memories of her father's final decline. Emily overheard phrases like resistance to antibiotics and unusual reaction to medication, words that made her blood run cold with recognition. Victoria's escape and pursuit turned into a nationwide manhunt that dominated news headlines. Security camera footage showed her slipping away through a network of maintenance tunnels beneath the city, emerging blocks away where she apparently had a vehicle waiting. The level of preparation revealed the depths of her contingency planning, something Emily had warned about but few had fully appreciated. The FBI became involved, their investigation uncovering a pattern of similar crimes spanning 2 decades. Victoria's trail led them to other grieving widowers, other suspicious deaths, and most disturbingly, other missing children. Each new discovery added to the growing horror of her legacy, while making her continued freedom even more terrifying. Emily watched the investigation unfold from Harrison's hospital room, where she maintained her vigil despite growing pressure to enter protective custody. "She'll find me anyway," she explained to the FBI agents who visited daily. "She always does." "At least here I can warn you when she comes." The agents exchanged concerned looks but couldn't argue with her logic. Emily had proven to be their most reliable source for predicting Victoria's patterns. The hospital itself became a fortress of security measures. Every visitor was thoroughly screened, every medication double-checked by multiple staff members. But Victoria had proven herself capable of infiltrating even the most secure locations. Twice, suspicious individuals were caught trying to access Harrison's floor using forged credentials that bore Victoria's trademark attention to detail. Rachel took to sleeping in shifts with Emily, neither girl willing to leave Harrison unprotected. They developed a system of codes and signals, learned to recognize every staff member by sight, and maintained constant vigilance for any sign of Victoria's presence. Their shared trauma created a bond that transcended their age difference, turning them into allies in their watch over Harrison. The police investigation revealed more of Victoria's preparation. She had safe houses established in multiple cities, each stocked with cash, fake identification documents, and various disguises. Bank accounts were discovered under dozens of aliases, all carefully managed to avoid detection. The sophistication of her escape network suggested she had always known this day might come. Most disturbing were the discoveries about her past victims. Bodies were exhumed, revealing trace evidence of the same poisons found in Robert Parker's system. Children who had disappeared into psychiatric facilities were traced to graves under different names, their deaths carefully disguised as medical complications or accidents. The full scope of Victoria's crimes proved far greater than anyone had imagined. Harrison's condition remained critical, with moments of improvement followed by mysterious setbacks. The doctors couldn't explain why his body seemed to resist standard treatments, or why his symptoms sometimes matched those of poisoned victims despite the hospital's strict security. Emily recognized the patterns, having watched her father's similar decline, but couldn't prove Victoria's continued influence over his care. The investigation into the hospital staff revealed several employees with connections to Victoria's network. A pharmacy technician was found to have been replacing medications in multiple patients' rooms. A custodian was discovered photographing confidential medical charts. Each revelation heightened the sense that Victoria's influence reached everywhere, like a poison in the hospital's very walls. Emily's own security team grew increasingly concerned about her safety. Victoria had been spotted near the hospital multiple times, always managing to disappear before she could be apprehended. Notes began appearing in Emily's food, in her clothes, even slipped under the door of Harrison's room, each one a reminder that Victoria could reach her at any time. Emily's fear of losing another protector grew with each passing day in the hospital. Harrison's condition fluctuated wildly. One moment he would seem to be recovering, the next his vital signs would crash inexplicably. The doctors were baffled by his body's resistance to treatment, running test after test, while Emily watched with growing dread, recognizing the same pattern from her father's final days. The community's realization of their mistake in dismissing Emily's warnings came too late. Hospital staff, who had once smiled indulgently at Victoria's attentiveness, now checked and rechecked every medication entering Harrison's room. Teachers who had attributed Emily's distress to grief and imagination sent tearful apologies through the police. Even the social workers who had recommended Emily's institutionalization now admitted their grave error in judgment. Security footage from the hospital revealed the true extent of Victoria's continued influence. Despite the heightened security, there were glimpses of her in various disguises as a nurse, a visitor, even once as a doctor making rounds. Each sighting sent the hospital into lockdown, but Victoria always managed to vanish before she could be caught, leaving only small signs of her presence: a moved photograph, a displaced item, a subtle reminder that she could reach them at any time. The FBI's investigation into the hospital staff uncovered a web of manipulation that stretched back years. Victoria had planted allies throughout the facility: orderlies who would look the other way, administrators who would alter records, maintenance workers who provided access to restricted areas. Each discovery led to another layer of conspiracy, revealing how thoroughly she had prepared for every contingency. Rachel became Emily's strongest ally in protecting her father. The teenage girl's determination matched Emily's, and together they developed an intricate system of checks and balances. They memorized the names and faces of every authorized staff member, created codes to verify legitimate personnel, and maintained constant surveillance of Harrison's room. Their vigilance caught several attempted infiltrations by Victoria's associates. The strain began to show on both girls. Rachel's normally perfect academic performance suffered as she split her time between school and hospital vigils. Emily, despite finally having access to regular meals and care, remained thin and watchful, starting at every unexpected sound. The hospital psychologist who observed them noted signs of severe trauma in both children, but neither would agree to leave Harrison's side. One night, during a rare moment when Harrison was conscious, he managed to share a crucial piece of information. "Victoria has someone inside," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the medical equipment. "Eye up. Be careful," who before he could finish, his vitals crashed again, sending the room into chaos as medical teams rushed to stabilize him. The investigation into hospital administration revealed disturbing connections. The chief of medicine was found to have received substantial donations from various aliases Victoria had used. The head pharmacist's family had mysterious financial ties to offshore accounts linked to Victoria's network. Even the hospital board showed signs of long-term manipulation through carefully placed donations and social connections. Emily's nights became a blur of anxiety and vigilance. She would doze fitfully in the chair by Harrison's bed, only to jerk awake at the slightest sound. The hospital corridors seemed to grow longer and more threatening with each passing night, every shadow potentially hiding Victoria or one of her accomplices. The security teams rotated regularly to maintain alertness, but Emily never fully relaxed. But the most chilling discovery came when a routine cleaning of Harrison's room revealed a hidden camera installed in the smoke detector. The device had been streaming footage to an unknown location, suggesting Victoria had been watching their every move. The FBI's technical team traced the signal but found only dead ends, Victoria's technical expertise proving as thorough as her other preparations. The final confrontation in the hospital came without warning on a quiet Sunday evening. Emily had been dozing in her usual chair while Rachel was getting coffee from the cafeteria. The shift change for nurses was approaching, and the usual evening lull had settled over the ICU wing. It was this precise moment Victoria had been waiting for. The first sign something was wrong came when the hospital's power flickered briefly. The backup generators kicked in immediately, but in those few seconds of darkness, something changed in Harrison's room. Emily woke to find a new figure standing by his bed, a nurse she didn't recognize, wearing a perfectly pressed uniform and an ID badge that looked flawless at first glance. "Don't move, dear." Victoria's familiar voice emerged from behind the surgical mask. She had dyed her hair dark brown and altered her appearance subtly, but her emerald eyes remained unmistakable. We wouldn't want to disturb the patient, would we? Her hand moved to Harrison's IV line with practiced efficiency. Emily's voice caught in her throat as she watched Victoria produce a small syringe from her pocket. "Security teams are monitoring every entrance," Emily managed to say, trying to keep her voice steady. "They'll be here any second." Victoria's laugh was soft and cold. "Oh, Emily, still so naive. Who do you think disabled the security cameras? Who scheduled this particular rotation of guards?" She began injecting something into Harrison's IV line. "I've had people in place here for years. Did you really think your little protection detail could stop me?" But the monitors attached to Harrison began to show subtle changes, his heart rate increasing slightly, his blood pressure fluctuating. Victoria watched the numbers with professional interest. "It's fascinating, really," she mused. "How easy it is to make a death look natural in a hospital. Everyone expects complications after a traumatic injury." Emily lunged for the emergency call button, but Victoria was faster. Her hand caught Emily's wrist in a painfully tight grip. "I wouldn't," she warned. "The wrong medication is already in his system. Calling for help now would only make his death more painful." Her other hand remained on the IV line, controlling the flow of whatever poison she was administering. The standoff was interrupted by Rachel's return. The teenager froze in the doorway, coffee cups crashing to the floor as she took in the scene. Victoria's momentary distraction was all Emily needed. She twisted free and slammed her small body into Victoria's side, disrupting her grip on the IV. What followed was chaos. Rachel screamed for help, while Emily fought with desperate strength, clinging to Victoria's arm to prevent her from reaching Harrison. The syringe went flying, shattering against the wall. Victoria's perfectly maintained composure finally cracked completely. "You meddlesome little brat," she snarled, all pretense of sophistication gone. "Just like your mother, always interfering, always ruining everything." Her hands found Emily's throat, manicured nails digging into soft flesh. "I should have killed you the same way I killed her." Security finally arrived, flooding the room with armed officers. Victoria held Emily like a shield, backing toward the window. "Stay back," she warned, "or I'll snap her neck before any of you can reach me." Her voice had taken on a manic edge that made the threat terrifyingly credible. Harrison, perhaps roused by the commotion, chose that moment to open his eyes. Despite his weakness, his voice carried clearly, "Victoria... you've lost. The FBI has everything. Your accounts, your aliases, your entire network. It's over." The words seemed to break something in Victoria. With a scream of rage, she threw Emily aside and lunged for Harrison's bed, determined to complete her final kill. Multiple security officers fired at once. Victoria's body jerked with the impact of several bullets, her perfect face registering surprise before she crumpled to the floor. The discovery of Victoria's diary proved to be the key that unlocked decades of meticulously planned crimes. The leather-bound journal was found in a hidden safe behind a painting in her mansion, its pages filled with precise handwriting that detailed every murder, every manipulation, every calculated step of her criminal career. The FBI agents who first read it were struck by the clinical detachment with which she documented her victims' deaths. The diary began with her first murder at age 18, her own father, the small-town pharmacist who had unwittingly taught her everything she knew about medications. "Daddy dearest thought he could control me," she had written. He never understood that his precious little girl had surpassed him in every way. The insulin overdose was practically poetic, his own medicine turning against him. Each subsequent entry revealed a pattern of escalating sophistication. Victoria had refined her techniques with each victim, learning from every close call and near discovery. The pages contained detailed observations about poison combinations, dosage calculations, and the most effective methods for manipulating medical records. Her attention to detail was both impressive and horrifying. Most chilling were her observations about the children of her victims. "Children are the weak link," she wrote. "They see too much, feel too much, notice things adults train themselves to ignore. Robert Parker's brat is particularly observant like her mother was. She'll need special handling." The entry was followed by detailed plans for Emily's eventual disappearance. The diary contained a particularly disturbing section about Sarah Parker's murder. Victoria had spent months studying Sarah's routine, noting her investigation into hospital financial records. "She was getting too close," Victoria wrote. The break line solution wasn't elegant, but sometimes the classics are best. The rain that night was an unexpected gift, nature collaborating in the perfect crime. The FBI's forensic team found something else hidden within the diary's leather cover, a USB drive containing videos of Victoria's conversations with various accomplices. These recordings revealed a network far more extensive than anyone had suspected. Doctors who provided prescriptions, lawyers who altered wills, even police officers who redirected investigations, all were implicated in her schemes. Perhaps most shocking were the financial records detailing Victoria's true wealth. She had accumulated millions through her marriages and murders, with funds scattered across offshore accounts under dozens of aliases. The complexity of her financial network suggested she had been planning her eventual exposure for years, preparing escape routes and contingency plans. Emily read the diary entries about her family with trembling hands, finally understanding the full scope of Victoria's manipulation. Every moment of kindness, every seemingly spontaneous gesture, had been calculated to build trust before the systematic destruction began. The pages revealed how Victoria had slowly isolated Robert, separating him from friends and colleagues who might have noticed his decline. The diary's final entries focused obsessively on James Harrison. Victoria's usually meticulous planning showed signs of desperation and haste. "The girl has complicated everything," she wrote. "Harrison is different, more observant, less easily manipulated. The timeline must be accelerated. There can be no mistakes this time." The last page contained a list of names, potential future targets Victoria had been researching before her plans unraveled. Each name was accompanied by detailed notes about their wealth, family situation, and potential vulnerabilities. The FBI estimated that had she not been stopped, Victoria could have claimed dozens more victims. The truth about Sarah Parker's accident emerged in devastating detail through Victoria's own meticulous records. What had appeared to be a tragic car crash on a rainy night was revealed as an intricately planned murder. Victoria had discovered that Sarah, a former nurse with a keen eye for medical inconsistencies, had been investigating strange patterns in hospital deaths connected to wealthy donors. The police reopened the case, this time armed with Victoria's detailed notes. They found that she had studied Sarah's daily routine for weeks, noting her habit of working late at the hospital library. Victoria had chosen a particularly stormy night, knowing Sarah would be exhausted from research. The break line hadn't been completely severed, Victoria's notes explained how she'd calculated exactly how long it would take to fail completely. Most heartbreaking was Sarah's own notes, discovered in a locked drawer at the hospital. She had been building a case against Victoria, documenting suspicious deaths and unexplained financial transactions. The final entry, dated the day of her death. Reed must protect Emily. V, more dangerous than I thought. Meeting with FBI tomorrow. That meeting never happened. Victoria's journal revealed how she had manipulated the accident investigation. She had cultivated relationships with key police officers, suggesting grief counseling for Emily that conveniently prevented the child from being questioned too closely. Medical examiners who might have noticed inconsistencies were distracted by generous donations to their departments. The diary contained photographs of Sarah's car after the crash, annotated with Victoria's clinical observations. She had calculated the exact spot on the mountain road where the brake failure would be most devastating, ensuring there would be no survivors. Her notes showed a chilling pride in the precision of her planning, perfect timing. The rain washed away any evidence of tampering. Emily learned that her mother had suspected Victoria's true nature months before her death. Sarah had noticed patterns in the deaths of wealthy hospital benefactors, all of whom had recently married or been courted by Victoria under various aliases. She had been carefully building evidence, working late into the night while trying to maintain a normal routine to avoid suspicion. The investigation revealed that Sarah had reached out to several colleagues with her suspicions, but Victoria's influence had run too deep. Each person Sarah had contacted had either been silenced through bribes or intimidation, or had mysterious accidents of their own. Victoria's network had ensured Sarah's concerns never reached the proper authorities. But most disturbing was Victoria's detailed observation of Emily in the weeks following Sarah's death. She had noted the child's grief reactions, her attempts to tell others about her suspicions, and had methodically worked to discredit her. "The girl has her mother's intuition," Victoria wrote, "but unlike Sarah, she can be dismissed as a traumatized child. Her very youth makes her powerless." The FBI discovered that Victoria had even manipulated Emily's grief counselor, ensuring that any attempts to speak about her suspicions would be attributed to trauma and denial. The therapist's notes, influenced by Victoria's careful suggestions, painted a picture of a troubled child unable to accept her mother's death, rather than one trying to expose a murderer. Sarah's colleagues, now free from Victoria's influence, came forward with memories of her final days. They recalled her increasing anxiety, her late nights poring over hospital records, and her determination to protect her family. One nurse remembered that Sarah saying, "If anything happens to me, everything I found is in my daughter's name." This led to the discovery of a safety deposit box registered to Emily, containing all of Sarah's evidence. Victoria's own abandoned daughter emerged from the shadows during the investigation, providing a shocking new dimension to the case. Catherine Wells, now 25, had been living under an assumed name in Seattle. She approached the FBI after seeing Victoria's photo on the news, her hands trembling as she presented her own documentation of her mother's crimes. Catherine's story was heartbreaking. She had been 12 when she first suspected her mother's true nature, watching helplessly as Victoria methodically poisoned her stepfather. Like Emily, she had tried to warn others, only to be labeled as troubled and attention-seeking. Victoria had eventually arranged for Catherine to be committed to a private psychiatric facility, where she spent 2 years before managing to escape. She always saw children as liability, Catherine testified, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "We noticed too much, questioned too much. Emily was lucky my mother usually made sure there were no witnesses left." She provided the FBI with journals she had kept since childhood, detailing Victoria's patterns of manipulation and murder. The similarities between Catherine and Emily's experiences were striking. Both had watched Victoria perfect her role as the caring stepmother while systematically destroying their families. Both had tried desperately to protect their fathers, only to be discredited and dismissed. The main difference was that Catherine had been forced to change her identity and live in hiding, knowing her mother would never stop hunting for loose ends. Catherine's testimony proved crucial in understanding Victoria's evolution as a killer. She described watching her mother practice different personas in front of mirrors, perfecting each gesture and expression until they seemed completely natural. Victoria had even used her daughter as a practice audience, refining her performances until they could fool even the most skeptical observer. The psychiatric facility where Catherine had been held was investigated, revealing a disturbing network of similar cases. Other children who had tried to expose their parents' murderers had been committed there, their legitimate concerns buried under diagnoses of paranoia and trauma. Many had never been heard from again. Most chilling were Catherine's descriptions of Victoria's teaching moments, times when she would explain her methodology to her daughter, seemingly proud of her criminal expertise. "She wanted me to admire her cleverness," Catherine explained. She saw herself as an artist, with murder as her medium. The perfect crime was her masterpiece. The investigation revealed that Catherine had been secretly helping Emily from afar. She had been the anonymous source sending Harrison information about Victoria's past, recognizing the patterns in his case from news reports. Her own trauma had driven her to try to protect another child from sharing her fate. Emily and Catherine's first meeting was emotional for both girls. Despite their age difference, they shared a unique understanding of what it meant to survive Victoria's manipulation. Catherine saw in Emily the child she had once been, while Emily found in Catherine living proof that it was possible to survive and overcome Victoria's influence. The bond between the two survivors grew stronger as they helped the FBI piece together Victoria's criminal history. Catherine could explain the significance of coded entries in Victoria's diary, while Emily's recent experiences helped track down current accomplices. Together, they provided a comprehensive picture of Victoria's decades-long campaign of murder and manipulation. The final confrontation with Victoria revealed the true depth of her depravity. When backup arrived at Harrison's hospital room that night, they found not just Victoria, but evidence of her ultimate plan. Her nurse's uniform concealed not only poison, but also detailed plans for eliminating everyone who knew her secrets, including her own daughter, Catherine. During her last stand, Victoria's careful facade crumbled completely, revealing the monster beneath the elegant exterior. "You're all so pathetically easy to fool," she snarled, her emerald eyes wild with rage. "Playing happy families, desperately wanting to believe in second chances. I gave you beautiful lies to die for, and you thanked me for them." The FBI's search of her temporary hideout uncovered the full scope of her intended final act. She had planned to poison Harrison's IV, stage Emily's suicide as a grieving child following her father, and arrange an accident for Catherine before disappearing with new identities already prepared. The precision of her planning extended even to planted evidence that would have implicated others in her crimes. Her final monologue, captured on hospital security cameras, became a chilling confession. She boasted about her murders, describing how she had perfected her technique over decades. Sarah Parker was clever. She taunted Emily, but not clever enough. She actually thought documentation would protect her. As if paper could stop a determined woman. Victoria's network of accomplices began to crumble under FBI pressure. Doctors who had falsified death certificates, lawyers who had manipulated wills, even bank managers who had facilitated her financial schemes all began turning on each other, desperate to make deals. Each confession revealed new layers of her intricate criminal enterprise. The most shocking revelation came from Victoria's personal physician, who had helped her maintain different identities through medical records. He revealed that Victoria had undergone multiple cosmetic surgeries to alter her appearance between schemes, explaining how she had evaded detection for so long. Each new identity had been crafted with surgical precision, both literally and figuratively. In her final moments, as security officers surrounded her, Victoria remained true to her narcissistic nature. "You should be thanking me," she declared, her voice dripping with contempt. "I gave you all such beautiful deaths. Like Sleeping Beauty, just drifting away in your beds. My only mistake was leaving witnesses her eyes fixed on Emily with pure hatred as she reached for a hidden weapon." The shots that ended Victoria's life came from multiple officers simultaneously. Even in death, she maintained her perfect posture, falling gracefully as though she had choreographed her own final moment. The emerald eyes that had charmed so many victims remained open, still seeming to mock those she had failed to destroy. Catherine's arrival at the hospital moments after her mother's death brought the story full circle. She rushed to Emily's side, protecting the younger girl from the sight of Victoria's body. The two survivors of Victoria's manipulation held each other, both finally free from the shadow that had haunted their lives. The aftermath revealed one final twist. Victoria had recorded everything. Her detailed journals, video recordings, and financial records were her tribute to herself, a carefully curated documentation of what she saw as her life's work. In her twisted mind, she hadn't just been committing murders, she had been creating art, with each death carefully staged and documented for posterity. James Harrison's recovery marked the beginning of a new chapter for all involved. After weeks in intensive care, he began showing genuine improvement, his body finally free from Victoria's poisonous influence. The doctors called it miraculous, but Emily recognized it as something simpler, the power of truth finally setting them all free. The legal proceedings moved swiftly, with Victoria's detailed records providing irrefutable evidence of her crimes. Her network of accomplices faced justice, many accepting plea deals in exchange for revealing the full scope of her operations. The FBI's investigation led to the reopening of dozens of cold cases, bringing closure to families who had spent years wondering about suspicious deaths. Emily's transition from street survivor to beloved daughter wasn't immediate, but Harrison's patience never wavered. He understood her nighttime checks of door locks, her need to verify her food and water were safe, her instinct to maintain escape routes. Instead of trying to change these habits immediately, he helped her develop healthier versions of them, turning hypervigilance into practical safety awareness. The relationship between Emily and Rachel deepened into true sisterhood. They shared a unique bond forged in their battle against Victoria, understanding each other's nightmares and anxieties in ways no one else could. Rachel became Emily's fierce protector at school, while Emily's strength inspired Rachel to face her own fears about losing her father. Catherine became a constant presence in their lives, filling the role of older sister and mentor to both girls. Her own healing journey paralleled Emily's, and together they worked through their shared trauma. Harrison legally adopted Catherine as well, giving her the stable family she had been denied for so long. The media attention eventually faded, but the impact of their story continued to create positive change. Harrison established a foundation dedicated to protecting children from domestic abuse and exploitation. The organization specialized in listening to and advocating for children whose concerns about their home situations were being dismissed. Emily's return to school was supported by a network of understanding teachers and counselors. Her academic performance, always strong, now had an additional focus. She began studying child psychology, determined to help other children who might be facing similar situations. Her experiences had given her a unique perspective on recognizing and responding to signs of abuse. The Parker family home, scene of so much tragedy, was transformed into a safe house for children and families escaping abusive situations. Sarah's garden, which Victoria had tried to destroy, was restored to its former wild beauty, becoming a healing space for traumatized families. Emily often spent time there, feeling closer to her mother's memory among the flowers Sarah had loved. 1 year after Victoria's death, Harrison organized a memorial service for all her victims. Families came from across the country to share their stories and find healing in their shared experiences. Emily spoke at the service, her voice strong as she honored her parents' memory and celebrated the new family she had found. The most profound change was in Emily herself. The frightened, lonely girl who had survived on the streets transformed into a confident young person with a clear purpose. She maintained her observant nature but learned to use it positively, channeling her experiences into helping others rather than just protecting herself. The community's apology and support manifested in meaningful ways that went beyond mere words. The hospital where Robert Parker had worked established a scholarship fund in his name, specifically for children who had survived domestic abuse. The medical board implemented new protocols for investigating suspicious deaths, incorporating many of the warning signs that Sarah Parker had identified before her murder. Emily's former teachers, who had dismissed her concerns about Victoria, became vocal advocates for listening to children's fears. They developed training programs to help educators recognize signs of manipulation and abuse, using Emily's story as a powerful example of how adult prejudices can blind them to children's valid concerns. The police department underwent a complete overhaul of its procedures for handling children's reports of suspicious behavior in their homes. Emily worked with them to create child-friendly reporting protocols, ensuring that young voices would be heard and taken seriously. The officers who had dismissed her initial reports became some of the strongest supporters of these changes. Harrison's recovery brought unexpected healing to the entire community. His foundation's work forced people to confront their own biases about what abuse looks like and who can perpetrate it. Victoria's sophisticated manipulation had shown that predators don't always fit expected profiles, leading to more nuanced approaches to investigating domestic abuse. The psychological impact of Victoria's crimes spurred significant changes in mental health care. Therapists and counselors developed new protocols for distinguishing between genuine childhood trauma and manipulated diagnoses. Catherine's experience in the psychiatric facility led to investigations of similar institutions and reforms in how children's mental health concerns are evaluated. Rachel's role in Emily's healing became a model for peer support programs in schools. She spoke at educational conferences about the importance of believing and supporting classmates who show signs of domestic trouble. Her perspective as someone who had initially doubted Emily, then became her strongest ally, carried particular weight. The safe house in the Parker family home became known as Sarah's Haven, honoring both Sarah Parker's attempt to expose Victoria and her daughter's eventual triumph over evil. The garden became a symbol of resilience, its wild beauty representing the strength that can grow from tragedy. Families who stayed there often spoke of finding peace among the flowers Sarah had planted. Emily's journey from victim to advocate inspired others to speak out about their own experiences. Support groups formed, connecting survivors of similar manipulative relationships. The understanding that they weren't alone, that others had faced and overcome similar challenges, proved powerfully healing for many. Catherine's integration into the Harrison family helped heal generations of trauma. Her professional work as a victim advocate, combined with her personal experience, made her particularly effective at identifying and helping other children in dangerous situations. She and Emily often worked together, their different perspectives complementing each other in their shared mission. The media narrative shifted from sensationalizing Victoria's crimes to examining the systemic failures that had allowed her to operate for so long. Journalists began investigating similar cases, leading to the exposure of other sophisticated abuse networks. Emily's story became a reference point for understanding how predators can manipulate social institutions to their advantage. Emily's healing and new family life blossomed in ways no one could have predicted. Harrison proved to be exactly the father figure she needed, patient with her trauma responses, understanding of her need for control, and consistently supportive of her healing journey. He never tried to replace Robert Parker in her heart, but created his own special place there. Family dinners became a sacred time in the Harrison household, with all four of them, James, Emily, Rachel, and Catherine, sharing their days and supporting each other through challenges. The simple act of sharing meals, something Victoria had used as a weapon of control, was transformed into a celebration of their chosen family's bond. Emily's room in the Harrison home reflected her journey of healing. One wall held photos of her parents and happy memories from before Victoria, honoring her past without letting it define her. Another displayed artwork she created during therapy, showing her progression from darkness to light. The window overlooked a garden she had planted herself, inspired by her mother's love of growing things. The relationship between the three girls evolved into something unique and powerful. Rachel, the middle sister, became the family's heart, her natural empathy helping bridge difficult moments. Catherine's protective instincts and hard-won wisdom provided guidance and support. Emily's resilience and determination inspired them all to keep growing stronger. School became a place of triumph for Emily. Her experiences gave her unique insights in psychology classes, and her teachers noted how she used her understanding of manipulation and trauma to help other students. She started a peer support group for children from troubled homes, creating the safe space she had needed during her own ordeal. Harrison's foundation grew into a powerful force for change, with all three girls contributing their unique perspectives to its mission. Catherine handled adult outreach, Rachel managed peer support programs, and Emily became the voice for children who needed to be heard. Together, they created a comprehensive approach to identifying and preventing domestic abuse. Emily's therapy progress became a model for treating complex childhood trauma. Her ability to maintain hope and compassion, even after experiencing such betrayal, inspired both mental health professionals and other survivors. She learned to integrate her experiences into her identity without being defined by them. The garden at Sarah's Haven flourished under the care of all three girls. Emily taught Rachel and Catherine about the flowers her mother had loved, and together they added new plants, creating a living symbol of growth and renewal. Families seeking shelter there often spoke of finding hope among the blooms, just as Emily had. Special occasions in the Harrison household took on new meaning. Birthdays became celebrations not just of life, but of survival and growth. Holidays were opportunities to create new traditions while honoring memories of loved ones lost. Every milestone was acknowledged as a victory over the darkness Victoria had tried to impose. Perhaps most significantly, Emily learned to trust her instincts again. The perceptiveness that had helped her survive Victoria's manipulation became a gift she used to help others. She developed a keen ability to identify children in trouble, often serving as the first person to recognize signs of abuse in her peers. The epilogue finds Emily at 18, standing in the graduation hall of her high school as valedictorian. Her speech weaves together themes of survival, truth, and the power of being heard. In the audience, Harrison beams with pride while Rachel and Catherine cheer loudly from their seats. The moment symbolizes not just academic achievement, but a complete triumph over the darkness that once threatened to consume her. Emily's college acceptance letter to study child psychology at Harvard arrives with a full scholarship, recognition of both her academic excellence and her advocacy work. Her application essay about transforming trauma into purpose catches the attention of leading researchers in childhood trauma studies, who invite her to contribute to their work even before she begins her studies. The Harrison Family Foundation expands internationally, with Emily's story inspiring similar organizations worldwide. Her experiences help shape new protocols for child protection services across multiple countries. The Foundation's annual conference becomes a gathering point for survivors, advocates, and professionals dedicated to preventing others from experiencing what Emily endured. Sarah's Haven grows into a network of safe houses, each maintaining the tradition of healing gardens started by Emily. The original Parker House becomes a training center for advocates and counselors, its rooms now filled with hope instead of fear. The garden where Sarah once taught Emily about resilience now teaches similar lessons to new generations of survivors. But Harrison's recovery proves complete, his health fully restored once freed from Victoria's poisonous influence. He channels his second chance at life into supporting Emily's mission, using his business acumen and connections to create lasting change in child protection laws. Their father-daughter bond grows stronger with each passing year, built on mutual respect and understanding. Catherine completes her law degree, specializing in advocating for children's rights in family courts. Her work ensures that children's voices are heard in legal proceedings, preventing others from being dismissed as she and Emily once were. Rachel follows in Harrison's philanthropic footsteps, managing the foundation's expanding operations while maintaining its personal touch. The most powerful testament to Emily's healing comes in her relationships with others. Despite everything she endured, she maintains her capacity for compassion and trust. Her ability to love and form deep connections, rather than being destroyed by Victoria's cruelty, grows stronger through the understanding that evil can be overcome. A memorial garden, created in honor of all Victoria's victims, becomes a place of healing and remembrance. Emily ensures that each victim is remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. The garden includes a special section dedicated to Sarah Parker, where Emily often sits to feel close to her mother's spirit. On quiet evenings, the Harrison family still gathers for dinner, their bond stronger for having been chosen rather than born. They share stories, dreams, and sometimes tears, each understanding the other's journey from darkness to light. Their home becomes a testament to the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Emily's story concludes with her starting her own journey as a child psychologist, specialized in helping young people who've survived similar traumas. Her office walls display both her Harvard diploma and a simple drawing she made during her darkest days on the street, a reminder of how far she's come and why she does this work. The frightened little girl who once stood alone against evil has become a powerful advocate for others facing their own battles, proving that the human spirit can triumph over the darkest circumstances when truth and love prevail. Dear viewers, if this story has touched your heart or resonated with your own experiences, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and your voice deserves to be heard. Support our team's commitment to bringing you meaningful stories by subscribing to our channel. If you found value in Emily's journey, help us spread its message by sharing this video with friends and family. Every like, comment, and share helps us continue creating content that matters. Together we can ensure that stories of resilience, hope, and triumph reach those who need them most.